Hello everyone, and welcome back to X-Ranger. Before we begin, I thought it would be interesting if each of you could leave a comment indicating which part of the world you're joining us from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Now let's get comfortable, relax and start our program. I was working as a fire lookout with my wife Rosemary and our son Adrian at the Webb Mountain Lookout in Lincoln County, Montana. This was back in July of 2005, and we'd rented this old fire tower about 12 miles from the Canadian border. I thought it would be this amazing adventure for our family. You know, disconnect from everything and just enjoy nature for a week. The first day was incredible. The views were breathtaking, and Adrian was so excited to be up in this tower that felt like a tree house in the sky. We cooked dinner on the little propane burner and watched the sunset paint the mountains in these gorgeous colors. I remember thinking this was exactly what we needed. Just the three of us, away from all the noise and stress of regular life. But that first night changed everything. Around 10:30, just as we were getting ready for bed, I started hearing these loud banging sounds coming from the forest below. It wasn't random. These were deliberate, rhythmic hits on trees, like something was using them as drums. Rosemary heard it too and grabbed my arm. "What is that?" she whispered. I told her it was probably just a bear marking territory or something, but deep down, I knew bears don't make sounds like that. Then came this smell. God, I'll never forget that smell. It was like rotten eggs mixed with wet dog and something else I couldn't identify. Something organic and foul that made my stomach turn. The smell was so strong it seemed to creep through the metal walls of the tower. Adrian was trying to sleep on the small cot we'd set up for him, but around 11, he sat up with tears streaming down his face. "Dad, what was that screaming?" His voice was shaking. I hadn't heard anything, but then it came again. This high-pitched shriek from somewhere to the south of us. It sounded like a woman being murdered. My blood went cold because there shouldn't be anyone else out here for miles. The sound made Adrian break down completely. He was sobbing and shaking, saying it was the scariest thing he'd ever heard. Rosemary pulled him close, but I could see she was terrified too. We all just sat there in the dark, listening to these awful sounds echoing through the valley below us. I managed to get Adrian calmed down and back to sleep around midnight, but I stayed awake, sitting by the window and looking out into the darkness. The forest had gone completely silent. No owls, no rustling, nothing. It was like every living thing had just vanished. Then, at exactly 2:10 in the morning, I remember checking my watch, I heard something that made my heart stop. There was something down at the base of our tower messing with the steel door. We were about 40 feet up, and there was this heavy metal door that sealed the bottom entrance. I could hear metal scraping against metal, like something was trying to figure out how the lock worked. I crept to the edge of the platform and looked down. In the moonlight, I could see this dark shape hunched over the door, using what looked like hands to manipulate the padlock. The thing was huge, easily 7 feet tall, even while crouched down. That's when I heard the footsteps. Heavy, deliberate steps on the rocky ground around the tower. Not the quick scurrying of a bear or the careful placement of a deer. These were the footsteps of something that walked upright. Something that was taking its time, circling our tower like it was studying it. I heard our empty beer bottle from earlier get knocked over and roll across the rocks. The sound seemed to echo forever in the stillness. Then there was this thud that shook the entire tower. I mean, the whole structure vibrated. Whatever was down there had jumped from one level of the rocky terrain to another with such force that we felt it 40 feet up. Rosemary woke up to the shaking. "What's happening?" she whispered. I put my finger to my lips and pointed down. Her eyes went wide when she heard the footsteps moving around the base of the tower. For almost 2 hours, we listened to this thing, or things, circulating around us. The footsteps were constant, methodical, like whatever was down there was mapping out every inch of the area. Sometimes the steps would get closer to the tower. Sometimes they'd move away into the trees, but they never stopped completely. The worst part was around 3:30, when we heard this sharp whistle coming from the east side of the tower. It was answered immediately by another whistle from the west side. My stomach dropped. There wasn't just one creature down there. There were at least two, and they were communicating with each other. Adrian woke up to the whistling and immediately started crying again. We were all terrified now, huddled together in the center of the small room, afraid to make any noise. I kept thinking about how exposed we were up here. Metal walls that anything could probably tear through, windows on all sides, and only one way down. That's when I made the decision to barricade ourselves in. I grabbed some of the firewood we'd brought up and started jamming logs across the trap door that led to the staircase. There was also this metal screen that covered part of the walkway around the tower. I pulled that loose and used it to block the entrance to the stairs from the outside platform. We didn't dare go out on the deck to look down. The sounds coming from below were getting more aggressive. More footsteps, things being knocked around, and those awful whistles going back and forth. At one point, I swear I heard what sounded like multiple voices having some kind of conversation, but not in any language I could understand. The hours crawled by. None of us slept. We just sat there in the dark, holding each other and listening to whatever was circling below us. The smell kept getting stronger and weaker as they moved around, like they were taking turns coming close to the tower. Around 5 in the morning, just as the first hint of light started showing in the east, everything went quiet. Not gradually, all at once, like someone had flipped a switch. The footsteps stopped, the whistling stopped, even that horrible smell started to fade. As the sun came up, I finally worked up the courage to look down from the platform. The ground around the tower was all scuffed up, and there were these depressions in the dirt that looked like massive footprints. But whatever had been down there was gone. We packed up and left that morning. I didn't want to spend another night in that tower, not after what we'd experienced, but before we left I decided to check the guest book that was kept in the tower. You know, where visitors write about their stay. What I found in that book made my blood run cold all over again. Entry after entry from previous guests describing strange experiences. One family wrote about unusual animal behavior and hearing large animals around the tower at night. Another entry mentioned seeing glowing eyes in the darkness and hearing sounds that didn't belong to any known wildlife. One entry that really got to me was from a couple who'd stayed there just 3 months before us. They wrote, "Woken by loud banging on trees and terrible smell. Something large walking around tower most of the night, left early. Would not recommend this location to anyone." There were at least a dozen entries over the past few years describing similar experiences. We weren't the first to encounter whatever lives in those mountains around the Webb Mountain lookout, and I doubt we were the last. The drive home was quiet. Adrian barely spoke for days afterward, and when he did, he kept asking me what those things were and why they were so interested in our tower. I didn't have answers for him because I didn't have answers for myself. That was over 15 years ago now, and I still think about that night regularly. I've done research on the area since then, read about other people's encounters in that part of Montana. Turns out Lincoln County has a long history of Bigfoot sightings, especially near the Canadian border where we were. I know what we experienced that night wasn't bears or any other normal wildlife. The intelligence behind the way they communicated, the way they methodically explored our tower, the sheer size and strength demonstrated by that leap that shook our entire structure. Nothing in those mountains behaves like that except maybe one thing. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if we'd stayed another night, or if those locks hadn't held, or if they'd figured out how to climb the tower itself. Part of me feels like we were being studied that night, like they were trying to understand what we were and why we were in their territory. I never reported what happened to any authorities because honestly, who would believe us? But that guest book proved we weren't crazy, and we definitely weren't alone in what we experienced up there. I haven't been back to Montana since, and I don't think I ever will. Some places are meant to stay wild, and whatever calls the mountains around Webb Mountain Lookout home has made it clear that humans aren't welcome after dark. The thing that still bothers me most is how organized they seemed. The way they whistled back and forth, coordinating their movements around the tower. That suggests a level of intelligence that's frankly terrifying when you're trapped 40 feet up with nowhere to run. We were lucky that night. I know that now. Lucky that the door held, lucky that they didn't try to climb up, and lucky that they seemed more curious than aggressive. But I'll never forget the feeling of being completely helpless while something massive and unknown circled below us in the darkness, taking its time to study us like specimens in a cage. That experience changed all of us, but it changed our family's relationship with the wilderness forever. We still camp and hike, but never anywhere that remote, and never without a solid exit plan. Because somewhere out there in the mountains of Montana, there are things that don't want to be found. And they'll make sure you know it if you get too close to their world. The story 2. I was 15 years old when it happened. My little sister Martha was 12, and we were walking home from school like we did 3 times a week. This was back in 1964, and we lived near Cormorant Lake in Manitoba. The walk from Clearwater Lake School to our family's cabin was about 7 miles through mostly wilderness, but we'd done it so many times it felt routine, safe even. It was a Tuesday afternoon in late September. The leaves were just starting to change, and there was this crisp smell in the air that made everything feel fresh and clean. Martha was chattering away about something her teacher had said, swinging her school bag back and forth as we walked along the dirt path that wound through the forest. We were maybe 4 miles from home when we came to this spot where the trail curved close to the water. There was this little inlet where the lake formed a quiet pool surrounded by birch trees and tall grass. It was one of our favorite places to stop and rest, especially on hot days. That's when we saw her. At first, I thought it was just some old woman doing her washing. She was crouched by the water's edge with her back to us, and from a distance, it looked completely normal. You'd see stuff like that sometimes. People who lived way out in the bush, doing their laundry in the lake because they didn't have running water. Martha, being Martha, started walking toward the water. She was always friendly like that, wanting to say hello to everyone we met on our walks. I was hanging back, something feeling a little off about the whole scene, but I couldn't put my finger on what. The woman was bigger than I'd first thought, a lot bigger. And her hair looked strange, kind of reddish and wild, hanging down past her shoulders in thick, matted chunks. She was wearing what looked like dark, rough clothing, and she was moving her arms in this weird, mechanical way as she worked at the water. Martha got to within maybe 20 feet and called out cheerfully, "Hello there!" That's when everything went wrong. The thing, and I knew immediately it wasn't a person, slowly stood up and turned around. I've never forgotten that moment, not in all these years since. It was like watching a nightmare come to life. It was at least 7 feet tall, maybe taller, covered in thick reddish-brown hair from head to toe. The face was the worst part. It looked almost human, but wrong in every possible way. The features were too big, too pronounced. The eyes were this bright orange color that didn't look natural, and they were staring right at Martha with an intelligence that made my skin crawl. But what terrified me most were its hands. They weren't hands at all, really. They were these long, clawed things that looked like they could tear a person apart without any effort. Martha screamed. Not the kind of scream you make when something startles you. This was pure terror. She tried to back away, but she was moving too slow, like she was in shock. The creature moved faster than anything that big should be able to move. In one fluid motion, it lunged forward and grabbed Martha by the arm. I could hear her crying, this awful, broken sound as it lifted her partly off the ground. I stood there for maybe 3 seconds, completely frozen. My little sister was in the grip of this monster, and I couldn't move, couldn't think, couldn't do anything but watch in horror. Then I heard Martha sob my name, and something inside me just snapped. There was a fallen branch near my feet, about as thick as a baseball bat and maybe 4 feet long. I grabbed it and charged at the thing, screaming at the top of my lungs. I don't even remember what I was yelling, probably just noise. I brought that branch down on the creature's arm as hard as I could. The impact sent shockwaves up my arms like hitting a tree trunk, but the branch held. The thing let out this growl that I felt in my chest. But it didn't let go of Martha, so I hit it again and again. I was swinging that branch like my life depended on it, which I guess it did. On the 4th or 5th hit, the branch finally broke, splintering apart in my hands. But it was enough. The creature dropped Martha, and she fell to her hands and knees, scrambling to get away. She was crying and trying to crawl behind me, but the thing was still reaching for her with those horrible clawed hands. I put myself between them, swinging the broken piece of branch that was left. It wasn't much of a weapon anymore, but it was all I had. Martha was throwing rocks from behind me, little ones that probably didn't hurt the creature at all, but at least she was fighting back. That's when we heard our brother Joe's voice shouting from somewhere in the trees. He'd heard our screams and was running toward us. I've never been so relieved to hear another human voice in my life. Joe came crashing through the underbrush with just his hunting knife, but he was yelling and making as much noise as possible. The 3 of us stood there together, facing down this monster, and I got my first really good look at it. The hair was definitely reddish, almost auburn in places where the sunlight hit it. But underneath, its skin was this grayish color, like old leather that had been left out in the weather too long. The face was deeply lined and weathered, but the eyes, those orange eyes, were sharp and alert. They moved back and forth between the 3 of us, like it was calculating its chances. Its body was massive, probably 3 times broader than Joe, who was a big guy. The arms were incredibly long, hanging down almost to its knees. And those hands, they were definitely more like claws, dark and curved, and ending in sharp points. But the strangest thing was how human-like it looked in some ways. The way it stood, the expression on its face, even the way it seemed to be thinking through the situation. This wasn't just some wild animal. There was intelligence there, and that made it so much worse. For what felt like forever, but was probably only 2 minutes, we all just stared at each other. None of us moved. The creature kept looking back and forth between us, and I had this terrible feeling that it was deciding whether it could take all 3 of us. Then, without any warning, it turned and walked into the forest. But it didn't just walk away like a person would. As soon as it reached the tree line, it started moving through the woods like nothing I'd ever seen. It was knocking down trees. Not little saplings, but full-grown birch and poplar trees that were 6 or 8 inches thick, just pushing them over like they were weeds. The sound was incredible. Crack, crash, crack, crash, as it bulldozed its way through the forest. We could track its movement by following the sound of falling trees, and it was moving fast, way faster than any person could move through dense woods. Within maybe 30 seconds, the crashing sounds were far enough away that we could barely hear them. And then there was silence. We didn't talk much on the rest of the walk home. Martha was shaking the entire time, and there were these dark bruises on her arm where the thing had grabbed her. Joe walked between us and the forest, constantly looking over his shoulder. When we got home and told our parents what happened, they didn't believe us at first. But when they saw the bruises on Martha's arm, bruises that matched the size and spacing of those clawed hands, their attitude changed real quick. My dad and some of the other men from nearby cabins went back to the spot the next day with guns. They found the fallen trees, dozens of them, forming a clear path through the woods. Some of the trees were 2 feet thick, and had been snapped off like twigs. They also found footprints in the soft ground by the water, massive prints, at least twice the size of a man's foot, but they never found the creature itself. Martha was never the same after that day. She started having these episodes where she'd just stare off into space, like she was listening to something the rest of us couldn't hear. When we'd ask her about it, she'd say the strangest things. She insisted that the creature had been trying to communicate with her somehow, that it had looked into her eyes and she'd felt it inside her head. She said it wasn't alone, that there were others like it in the deep woods, and they'd been watching our family for a long time. The worst part was when she'd talk about how they were the real people, the original inhabitants of the land, and we were the intruders. She'd get this distant look and say they weren't happy about us being there, that they wanted us to leave. My parents were worried enough that they took her to see a doctor in town, but he couldn't find anything wrong with her physically. He said it was probably just trauma from the attack, that she'd get better with time. But she didn't get better. If anything, she got worse. She started having nightmares every single night, waking up screaming about orange eyes and clawed hands. During the day, she'd refuse to go anywhere near the forest. Even looking at the tree line from our cabin would make her start crying. And she kept talking about how they were calling to her, trying to get her to come back to the woods. She said she could feel them out there, waiting and watching. We moved away from Cormorant Lake that winter. My dad said it was for work, but I knew it was really because of what happened to Martha. He hoped that getting her away from that place would help her forget. It didn't work. Even hundreds of miles away, she'd still wake up screaming. She'd still get that distant look and talk about hearing them in her mind. The doctors we saw in the city called it post-traumatic stress, but they couldn't do much to help her. Martha never fully recovered from that encounter. She lived with our family until she was in her 20s, but she was never really present, you know. It was like part of her had stayed back in those woods by Cormorant Lake, trapped with that creature. I'm in my 70s now, and I still think about that day constantly. I've read everything I can find about Sasquatch encounters, and our story matches up with dozens of others from that same region of Manitoba. Apparently, the area around Cormorant Lake and Clearwater Lake has a long history of sightings, but knowing that doesn't make it any easier to live with what happened. Knowing that we weren't the only ones doesn't change the fact that my little sister's life was destroyed by something that most people refuse to believe exists. The thing that haunts me most is the intelligence I saw in those orange eyes. This wasn't some mindless beast acting on instinct. It had grabbed Martha specifically, deliberately. It had been watching us, probably for a long time before that day. And the way it looked at all three of us before it left, like it was memorizing our faces, like it would remember us if we ever crossed paths again. That look promised that this wasn't over, that we'd be seeing each other again someday. I never went back to that part of Manitoba. Never wanted to. But sometimes, especially on cold autumn days when the air smells like falling leaves, I can still hear the sound of those trees crashing down as it disappeared into the forest. And I wonder if it's still out there, waiting by that quiet pool where the trail curves close to the water, waiting for another pair of children to walk by on their way home from school. Story 3. This happened back in July of 2007. I was out in Clark County, Idaho, with a buddy of mine, doing some exploring around the Birch Creek area. We'd been planning this trip for months, just the two of us, our ATVs, and a couple days of camping in some of the most remote country you can find in Idaho. We'd set up camp in this place called 8 Mile Canyon, which is basically just a wide spot between two ridges where you can pitch a tent without worrying about rolling down a hillside in your sleep. It's pretty country, don't get me wrong, but it's isolated as hell. You don't see another human being for days out there. It was our first afternoon, and we figured we'd take the ATVs out and scout around before it got dark. Get familiar with the area, maybe find some good trails to explore the next day. My buddy, I'll just call him Dave, he was riding this old Polaris that made enough noise to wake the dead. I had my Honda, which was newer and ran a lot quieter. We found this trail that looked promising, heading up into a canyon that was darker and more heavily wooded than the area around our camp. The trees were thick, mostly pine and fir, and they blocked out a lot of the afternoon sun. It was cooler in there, which felt good after riding in the heat, but there was something about the place that felt off, like we were being watched or something. The trail twisted back and forth as it climbed, and the vegetation got denser the further we went. Eventually, we reached this spot where the canyon narrowed down and the trees closed in so tight you could barely see 10 feet in either direction. That's when Dave decided he'd had enough exploring for one day. We turned around and started heading back toward camp. By then, the sun was getting low, and we had our headlights on even though it wasn't completely dark yet. That in-between time when everything looks kind of grey and shadowy. I was following behind Dave, maybe 20 feet back, when I saw what I thought was just this weird stump sitting right beside the trail. It was maybe 4 feet tall, dark-colored, and had this odd shape that didn't look quite natural. But you see stuff like that all the time in the forest. Dead trees, broken stumps, rocks that look like something they're not. The thing is, I didn't remember seeing that stump on the way up the trail, and I'm pretty good at noticing landmarks and stuff like that. But I figured maybe I'd just missed it earlier, you know? Sometimes, when you're concentrating on navigating, you don't notice everything around you. Dave rode past it without slowing down, his headlights sweeping over it for just a second. But as I got closer, something made me look at it more carefully. There was something wrong about the shape, something that didn't fit with it being a tree stump. That's when the damn thing stood up. I'm not kidding. This thing that I'd thought was a dead stump just unfolded itself and stood up to its full height. And it was massive. Had to be at least 8 feet tall, maybe taller. Covered in dark hair from head to toe, so thick and matted that you couldn't see any skin underneath. At first, it was looking in Dave's direction, watching his taillights disappear around the next bend. Then, like it could sense me staring at it, it turned to look over its right shoulder at me. I was maybe 15 feet away when our eyes met. Its face was this horrible mix of human and animal features. The eyes were this yellowish color that seemed to glow in my headlight beam. The nose was flat and wide, and when it opened its mouth slightly, I could see these huge teeth. But the worst part was its hand. Its right arm was extended toward the trail, and the hand was reaching out like it was trying to grab something. The fingers were long and dark, definitely more human-like than animal, but thicker and more muscular than any person's hand should be. I was going maybe 15 miles per hour when I saw it, and my first instinct was just to keep going. Get past this thing as fast as possible and catch up with Dave. So I ducked my head down and gunned it. But as I rode past, I got hit with this smell that nearly knocked me off my ATV. It was like nothing I'd ever smelled before. Kind of like an elk during rutting season, but 10 times stronger and mixed with this sour, rotten odor that made my stomach turn. The whole encounter lasted maybe 4 seconds, but those details are burned into my memory forever. The way its head turned to track my movement as I passed. The intelligence in those yellow eyes. The casual way it had been crouched there, perfectly still, like it was used to hiding in plain sight. By the time I caught up with Dave back at camp, my hands were shaking so bad I could barely shut off my ATV. He was already unloading his gear, talking about what we should cook for dinner, completely oblivious to what had just happened. I tried to tell him about it, but I could see in his eyes that he thought I was either making it up or had spooked myself over nothing. He kept saying stuff like, "Are you sure it wasn't just a bear? Or maybe it was a person in camouflage gear." But I knew what I'd seen, and it wasn't a bear, and it sure as hell wasn't a person. The thing that really got to me was how perfectly still it had been when I first spotted it. Like it knew exactly how to blend in with its surroundings. And the way it stood up, not startled or surprised, just calmly rising to its full height like it had been waiting for the right moment. I barely slept that night. Every little sound had me sitting up in my sleeping bag, listening. Dave was snoring away, but I kept thinking about those yellow eyes and wondering if that thing was somewhere out there in the darkness, watching our camp. The next morning, I convinced Dave to ride back up that trail with me. I wanted to show him the spot, maybe find some tracks or other evidence. But when we got there, the area looked completely different in the daylight. The trail seemed wider, the trees not as dense, and I couldn't find the exact spot where I'd seen the creature. We spent a good hour looking around, but there was nothing. No footprints, no bent branches, no sign that anything unusual had happened there. Dave was getting impatient, and I could tell he was starting to think I'd imagined the whole thing. But I knew I hadn't imagined it. The memory was too clear, too specific. The smell alone was something I could never have made up. We finished our camping trip without any other incidents, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched the whole time. Sometimes I'd catch movement in my peripheral vision, but when I'd turn to look, there was nothing there. The drive home was quiet. Dave had stopped asking about what I'd seen, and I'd stopped trying to convince him. But the whole experience had changed something for me. I'd always loved exploring remote areas, but now I couldn't stop thinking about what else might be out there, hiding just out of sight. 2 years later, Dave and I decided to go back to the same area. We were both curious to see if we could find that trail again, and I guess part of me wanted to prove to myself that what I'd seen was real. But when we got to 8 Mile Canyon, we found that the Forest Service had put up this elaborate barrier system blocking access to that specific trail. There were concrete barriers, metal posts, and signs everywhere declaring the trail closed to motorized vehicles. The barriers looked expensive and permanent, not like the usual temporary closures you see for erosion control or wildlife protection. When we asked about it at the local ranger station, they just said the trail had been closed for resource protection. No specifics, no explanation of what resources they were protecting or why, just a standard bureaucratic answer that didn't tell us anything. But here's the thing that really bothers me. In all my years of riding ATVs in Idaho, I've never seen the Forest Service put that much effort into closing a single trail. Usually they just put up a simple gate or some orange cones. This was different. This was like they really didn't want people going up that canyon anymore. I've done a lot of research since then, reading about Bigfoot sightings in Idaho and the surrounding states. Turns out Clark County has had more than its share of unexplained encounters over the years, and several of them happened in the same general area where we were camping. There's this pattern I've noticed in a lot of these reports. The creature is almost always described as being incredibly good at staying hidden, blending in with its surroundings until the last possible moment, like they've evolved specifically to avoid being seen by humans. That's what still gives me chills when I think about that day. The realization that this thing had probably been watching us for who knows how long before I finally noticed it. Maybe it had been tracking our movements since we entered the canyon. Maybe it had been observing our camp, learning our routines. The fact that it was positioned right beside the trail suggests it knew we'd be coming back that way. It wasn't just randomly hiding. It was deliberately positioned to get a close look at us as we passed by. I've tried to convince myself over the years that maybe I was wrong about what I saw. Maybe it was just a bear standing up on its hind legs, or a person in some kind of ghillie suit. But every time I think about those details, the yellow eyes, the human-like hand, the way it moved, I know that's not what it was. The smell is what really gets to me when I remember it. I've been around plenty of wild animals, elk, deer, bears, you name it. But nothing smells like what I encountered that day. It was organic but wrong somehow, like something that wasn't supposed to exist. And the intelligence I saw in those eyes still haunts me. This wasn't some dumb animal reacting on instinct. It was studying me just as much as I was studying it. There was a calculation there, a decision-making process that was way too advanced for any known animal. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd stopped my ATV instead of riding past. What if I'd tried to communicate with it somehow? But honestly, I was too terrified in that moment to do anything except get away as fast as possible. The hand reaching toward the trail still bothers me the most. Was it trying to grab me? Was it just curious about the noise and lights? Or was it some kind of threat display, letting me know that I was in its territory? I'll never know the answers to those questions, but I know one thing for certain. There are things living in the remote forests of Idaho that science hasn't catalogued yet. Things that are smart enough to stay hidden from humans most of the time, but occasionally make themselves known to unlucky people like me. That trail closure wasn't random. The Forest Service knows something about what's up in that canyon, and they don't want civilians stumbling into it. Which makes me wonder how many other people have had encounters like mine, and how many of those encounters have been officially documented and then buried. I still ride ATVs, and I still love exploring remote country. But I'm a lot more careful now about where I go and what I might find there, because somewhere out in those dark canyons of Idaho, something is watching and waiting. And next time, I might not be lucky enough to just ride away. Story 4. This happened on October 20th, 2015. I remember the exact date because it was during hunting season, and I'd been looking forward to this trip for months. I was up in Clark County, Idaho, camping with my 83-year-old dad and my brother at Pleasant Valley Creek. We'd been going to this same spot for years. It's remote, the hunting's good, and we knew the area like the back of our hands. It was 6:15 in the evening when everything changed. I'd positioned myself up on this ridge called Swampy Draw for the evening hunt. It's a good spot. You can see for maybe 300 yards in most directions, and deer like to move through that area right before dark. I was sitting there with my rifle scanning the tree line when I saw two figures walking up the main trail about 200 yards away. My first thought was that they were other hunters heading back to their camp. You see that sometimes during hunting season, guys walking the trails in pairs, carrying their gear, but something felt off about the way they were moving. They were walking upright, sure, but there was something weird about their gait. Too smooth, maybe, and they looked bigger than normal people, even at that distance. I pulled up my binoculars to get a better look, thinking maybe they were wearing heavy packs or bulky hunting clothes. That's when I realized these weren't people at all. They were completely black from head to toe, and I don't mean they were wearing black clothes. I mean their entire bodies were covered in dark hair or fur. No clothing, no gear, nothing. Just these massive hair-covered figures walking upright like humans. The bigger one had to be at least 8 feet tall, maybe a little more. The second one was slightly shorter, maybe 7.5 feet, but still way bigger than any person I'd ever seen. And the way they moved was incredible. Their arms were swinging in these long arcs, hanging down almost to their knees. I watched them through my binoculars for maybe 30 seconds, trying to process what I was seeing. They were walking with purpose, like they knew exactly where they were going. Not wandering around like animals would, but moving with intention along that trail. Then one of them, the taller one, stopped and looked directly at me. Even at 200 yards, I could feel its gaze. It nudged the other one, and they both turned to stare up at my position on the ridge. That's when the fear really kicked in. These things knew I was there, and they were studying me just like I was studying them. For maybe 10 seconds, we all just looked at each other. Then, without any apparent communication between them, they both turned and melted into the forest. I don't mean they walked into the trees, I mean they just disappeared. 1 second they were there on the trail. The next second they were gone. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I stayed in my position for another 10 minutes, scanning the area with my binoculars, but I didn't see any more movement. Whatever those things were, they'd vanished completely. The problem was, they'd been between me and the trail back to our camp. I couldn't just walk straight down like I normally would because I'd have to go right through the area where I'd last seen them. So I waited, trying to convince myself that maybe they'd moved on, maybe they were long gone by now. Finally, as it was getting really dark, I decided I had to risk it. I couldn't spend the night up on that ridge, and my dad and brother would start worrying if I didn't come back soon, so I shouldered my rifle and started picking my way down the slope toward the trail. I was moving as quietly as possible, stopping every few feet to listen. The forest had gone completely silent. No birds, no squirrels, nothing. Just this oppressive quiet that made every step I took sound like a gunshot. I was about halfway back to camp when I found the barricade. There was this massive log laying right across the trail, blocking it completely. It hadn't been there when I'd walked up to my hunting spot a few hours earlier. This log was huge, probably 3 feet thick and at least 20 feet long. It would have taken heavy equipment to move something that size. But here's the thing that really freaked me out. The log was positioned perfectly across the trail, like someone had placed it there on purpose. And it was lying in the creek that ran alongside the path, so you couldn't just walk around it easily. I stood there staring at this barrier for maybe 5 minutes, trying to figure out what to do. My ATV was back at camp, but even if I went to get it, I wasn't sure I could get over or around this log. The creek was running pretty deep on both sides, and the banks were steep, but I didn't have much choice. The adrenaline was really pumping now, and all I wanted was to get back to camp, where my dad and brother were waiting. So I climbed over the log and kept going. When I finally made it back, I immediately told them what I'd seen. My dad's been hunting these mountains for over 50 years, and my brother's no rookie either. But when I described those two figures walking up the trail, they both got real quiet. My brother asked me if I was sure they weren't just people in dark clothing, maybe other hunters, but I knew what I'd seen. The size, the way they moved, the proportions. Nothing about them was human. The next morning, we decided to ride our ATVs back to check out that log. I wanted to show them the barricade, and honestly, part of me was hoping it would be gone. Maybe I'd imagined how big it was, or maybe someone had moved it during the night. But when we got there, it was worse than I'd remembered. Not only was the original log still there, but someone or something had reinforced the barricade. There were additional logs, stumps and branches piled up, creating this elaborate barrier that completely blocked the trail. Some of these logs were so big that the three of us together couldn't have budged them. We're talking about chunks of dead timber that probably weighed 1,000 pounds each. And they'd been arranged with purpose, fitted together like puzzle pieces to create an impenetrable wall. My dad walked around the whole structure, examining it from every angle. He's got decades of experience in these woods, and he'd never seen anything like it. The logs weren't weathered or old. They'd been freshly broken and moved. Some still had sap bleeding from where they'd been snapped off. But the most disturbing part was what we found near our camp. There was this structure made of interwoven branches, maybe 8 feet tall, that definitely hadn't been there when we'd set up our tents. It looked almost like a giant bird's nest, but built vertically against a tree. The main support was this living pine tree that had been bent over in an arch. Not broken, bent. The tree was maybe 6 inches thick, and it had been curved into this unnatural shape that no human could have managed. The amount of force required would have been incredible. My brother tried to straighten the tree back to its original position, but even with all three of us pulling, we couldn't budge it. Whatever had bent that tree was unbelievably strong. But here's what really got to me. The pattern of broken branches around the structure looked deliberate, like someone had been testing different configurations, trying to build something specific. There was intelligence behind it, planning and experimentation. The hunting after that first day was completely different. Before my sighting, we'd been seeing deer all over the place. I'm talking about 30 or more deer in the area around our camp. But after that encounter on the ridge, it was like every animal in the forest had just vanished. We spent 4 more days hunting in that area, and we didn't see a single deer. Not one. No tracks, no droppings, no signs that they'd ever been there at all. It was like the entire ecosystem had been cleared out overnight. The nights were the worst part. We'd always been comfortable camping in these mountains, but now every sound outside our tents had us on edge. And there were sounds. Footsteps in the rocks around our camp, branches breaking in the distance, and this occasional low humming that seemed to come from multiple directions at once. On the 3rd night, I heard the door of my horse trailer opening and closing. I'd brought my horses on this trip, and they were secured in a 2-horse trailer about 50 yards from our main camp. The trailer has this heavy metal door that makes a very distinctive sound when it opens, a loud creak followed by a solid thunk when it closes. I heard that exact sequence 3 times during the night. Creak thunk, creak thunk, creak thunk. But when I checked in the morning, both horses were still secure inside and nothing had been taken. The door was properly latched, just like I'd left it. What bothered me was that this trailer is built to contain 1,000-pound animals. The latch mechanism requires significant hand strength to operate, and you have to lift the door while you're working the handle. It's not something that could happen accidentally or be operated by any normal wild animal. My horses were acting strange too. These are experienced trail horses that have camped in remote areas dozens of times, but for the entire trip, they were nervous and skittish. They kept looking toward the tree line and refusing to graze in areas where they normally would have been comfortable. On our last day, I went back up to the ridge where I'd first seen those 2 figures. I wanted to see if I could spot any tracks or other evidence of what I'd encountered. The ground up there is pretty rocky, so I wasn't expecting much, but I found something that made my blood run cold. There were these depressions in a patch of soft dirt, definitely footprints, but way too big to be human. I put my own boot next to one of them for comparison, and the print was easily twice as long and much wider than mine. The prints were deep too, like whatever made them was incredibly heavy, and the spacing between them suggested a stride length that no human could match. These things weren't just tall, they were built on a completely different scale than people. I took some pictures with my phone, but when I got home and tried to download them, the files were all corrupted. Every single photo from that last day was just digital noise, like the camera had malfunctioned. But all my other pictures from the trip were fine. Just the ones from that final day on the ridge were destroyed. It's been years since that hunting trip, and I still think about what I saw almost every day. I've done a lot of research on Sasquatch sightings in Idaho, and the Pleasant Valley Creek area has a long history of encounters. Apparently, I'm not the first person to see multiple creatures in that location. What bothers me most is how organized they seemed. The way they moved together, communicated without making any sound I could hear, and then disappeared so efficiently. And the barricades they built after my sighting, that wasn't random destruction. That was strategic thinking, like they were trying to control access to their territory. The fact that all the wildlife disappeared suggests these creatures are at the top of the food chain in those mountains. Deer, elk, even predators like bears and mountain lions, everything clears out when these things move through an area. I've been back to Clark County several times since then, but never to that specific drainage. Part of me is curious to see if those barricades are still there or if they've built new structures. But a bigger part of me knows that I was warned off that day and I should respect that warning. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd tried to approach them instead of just watching from a distance. Would they have communicated with me somehow? Or would I have ended up as just another missing person story in the Idaho wilderness? I'll never know the answer to that, but I know one thing for certain. There are things living in the remote mountains of Idaho that science hasn't classified yet. Things that are intelligent enough to use tools, build structures, and control territory. And they don't want to be found. That barricade wasn't built by chance. It was a message, clear as day. Stay out. And after seeing what I saw on that ridge, I'm more than happy to respect their wishes. Story 5. This happened in 2016 at Lake Vesuvius in Ohio. I'd been camping there dozens of times over the years. It's one of my favorite spots for bass fishing, and the campground is usually pretty quiet except during peak summer season. I'd gotten campsite number 16, which is way back in the woods, separated from the main camping area by maybe a quarter-mile of forest. Most people don't like that site because it feels too isolated, but that's exactly why I chose it. I wanted peace and quiet, just me and the fish. I'd had a great day on the water, caught 5 largemouth bass, all decent sized. I cooked one of them over the campfire for dinner. Nothing beats fresh bass cooked over an open flame. The other 4 I cleaned and put in my cooler inside the travel trailer I was staying in. The trailer is small, just a basic model with a bed, tiny kitchen area, and not much else. But it keeps the weather out and gives you a place to store your gear. I'd parked it backing up to the tree line with the door facing the lake so I could sit outside and watch the water. I went to bed around 10:30, tired from a full day of fishing. The trailer has windows on both sides, one facing the lake and one facing the forest. I always sleep with both windows cracked open for air circulation, especially in the summer when it gets stuffy inside. I was sound asleep when this whistle woke me up. But calling it a whistle doesn't really do it justice. This was the loudest, most piercing sound I'd ever heard. It was so sharp and sudden that it literally threw me out of bed. I mean, 1 second I was lying there sleeping. The next second, I was on the floor with my ears ringing. My first thought was that someone was in serious trouble. Maybe a camper signaling for help or something, but as I got my bearings, I realized the sound had come from right outside my trailer. Like, right outside the window that faces the forest. That's when I saw the shadow move away from the window. The window in my trailer is about 6 feet off the ground. You'd have to be pretty tall to look through it, or standing on something. But I definitely saw a dark shape moving away from that window, heading toward the back of my trailer. I grabbed my flashlight and my walking stick. It's this heavy oak staff that I use for hiking, but it makes a decent weapon if you need one. My heart was pounding as I opened the trailer door and stepped outside. The campsite was completely dark, except for the dying embers of my fire. No moon that night, and the trees blocked out most of the starlight. I switched on my flashlight and started walking around the trailer to see what had been at my window. As I came around the back corner of my truck, I swept the flashlight beam toward the rear of the trailer. That's when I saw it. There was this massive creature standing next to my trailer, right by the window where I keep my cooler. It was trying to smell through the screen, its face pressed up close to the mesh. The thing was huge, at least 7.5 feet tall, maybe 8 feet. It was covered in brown hair with these reddish highlights that caught my flashlight beam. The hair was thick and matted, like it hadn't been groomed in years. But what really got my attention was how skinny it looked. This wasn't some massive, bulky creature. It looked almost malnourished. Its face was the most disturbing part. There was this raised scar running down one side, all puffy and infected looking. The features were definitely more human than animal, but wrong in every way. The eyes were deep set and dark, the nose was flat and wide, and when it opened its mouth I could see these huge yellow teeth. When my flashlight beam hit it, the creature turned to look at me. For maybe 3 seconds, we just stared at each other. Then it made this sound, kind of a rough barking noise that came from deep in its chest. That bark was answered immediately by another whistle from beyond my trailer. The same piercing sound that had woken me up, but coming from a different direction. The creature next to my trailer responded with 2 sharp whistles of its own. There were at least 2 of them out there, and they were communicating with each other. The one by my trailer suddenly started moving toward me, not running, but covering ground incredibly fast with these long, fluid strides. It moved like nothing I'd ever seen, smooth and coordinated, but with this power behind every step that was terrifying. As it passed by me, I felt the air move from its momentum. It was so close that its hair actually brushed against my arm. The smell hit me like a physical blow, this combination of wet dog, rotting meat, and something else that I can't even describe. It was so bad that I actually gagged. I ran back to my trailer and grabbed my Glock from the nightstand. I'm not usually one to pull a gun on wildlife, but this wasn't normal wildlife, and I was scared out of my mind. As soon as I had the pistol in my hand, the creature, or creatures, started beating on the outside of my trailer. The whole structure was shaking like there was an earthquake. These weren't random impacts. They were deliberate, rhythmic hits that made the trailer rock back and forth on its stabilizer jacks. I had to grab the edge of the table to keep from falling over. The pounding continued for maybe 2 minutes, coming from different sides of the trailer. Sometimes it would be on the back wall, sometimes on the side, like they were circling around and taking turns. Each impact sounded like someone hitting the aluminum siding with a sledgehammer. Then I heard voices outside, not animal sounds, voices, 2 distinct voices, having what sounded like a conversation, but in no language I could understand. It was definitely communication, though. One would make a series of sounds, the other would respond, then the first would answer back. They were planning something. That's when I made the decision to give them what they wanted. I grabbed the plastic bag with the 4 cleaned bass from my cooler and opened the trailer door just wide enough to throw it outside. The pounding stopped immediately. I heard movement outside, then this wet tearing sound, like something was being ripped apart. Through the window, I could see one of the creatures in my flashlight beam. It had picked up the bag and was holding one of the fish between its teeth while carrying the other 3 in its hands. But they didn't leave. Instead, the pounding on my trailer started up again, even harder than before. The whole structure was bouncing and shaking so violently that I was sure it was going to tip over. Cabinet doors were flying open, my dishes were rattling, and I could hear the aluminum siding starting to buckle. This went on for hours, literally hours. The pounding would stop for a few minutes and I'd think they were gone. Then it would start again from a different direction. Sometimes it sounded like they were on the roof, walking around up there and stomping on the thin aluminum. The voices continued too. They'd have these conversations right outside my trailer, sometimes seeming to argue about something, sometimes sounding like they were coordinating their attacks on the structure. Around 2 in the morning, I tried calling the campground office, but there was no cell service back in Site 16. I was completely cut off, trapped in this metal box, while these creatures terrorized me. The worst part was not knowing how many there were. Based on the voices, I was pretty sure there were at least 2, but sometimes it sounded like more, and they were smart. They seemed to understand that I was inside the trailer and that they could intimidate me by shaking it. At one point, around 3:30, something heavy landed on my roof. The impact was so hard that it dented the ceiling inward right above my head. Then I heard footsteps up there, not the quick scurrying of a raccoon or squirrel, but the deliberate steps of something big and heavy walking around. The footsteps moved from the front of the trailer to the back, then stopped right above where I was sitting. For maybe 5 minutes, there was complete silence. I could feel this presence up there, like it was listening to me breathe, trying to figure out exactly where I was inside. Then the pounding started again, but now it was coming from above. Whatever was on my roof was jumping up and down, trying to cave in the ceiling. Each impact sent shockwaves through the entire trailer, and I could see the metal starting to buckle and warp. I honestly thought they were going to get inside. The trailer wasn't built to withstand that kind of abuse, and I could hear rivets popping and seams starting to separate. If they'd kept it up much longer, they would have torn the thing apart, but around 4 in the morning, everything suddenly stopped. The pounding, the voices, the footsteps on the roof, all of it just ceased at once. The silence was almost as terrifying as the noise had been. I sat there in the dark, listening to my own heartbeat and waiting for the next attack, but it never came. As the sun started to rise, I finally worked up the courage to look outside. The campsite was empty, and there was no sign that anything unusual had happened, except for the damage to my trailer. The dents in the roof were real enough, deep depressions in the aluminum that couldn't have been made by any normal animal. The siding had buckle marks all around the base where they'd been hitting it, and there were these massive handprints in the dirt around the trailer, prints that were easily twice the size of my own hands. I packed up and left Lake Vesuvius that morning, and I haven't been back since. The experience changed my whole relationship with camping and the outdoors. I used to love the solitude of remote campsites, but now I stick to places with plenty of other people around. What bothers me most about that night is how intelligent they seemed. The way they communicated with each other, coordinated their attacks on my trailer, and seemed to understand that I was trapped inside. These weren't just random animals looking for food. They were thinking, planning creatures. And they were definitely hungry. The way that one creature had pressed its face against my window, trying to smell the fish in my cooler, that was purposeful behavior. They'd probably been watching me all day, maybe even following the scent of the fish I'd cooked for dinner. The fact that there were multiple creatures working together is what really scares me. If it had been just one, maybe I could have convinced myself it was some kind of bear or other known animal. But the coordination between them, the way they seem to have a plan, that suggests a level of intelligence that's frankly terrifying. I've done research on Bigfoot sightings in Ohio since then, and apparently the area around Lake Vesuvius has had encounters going back decades. There are reports of creatures matching the same description: tall, hair-covered, intelligent and aggressive when they want something. But most of the reports I've read describe solitary encounters. What I experienced was different. This was organized, systematic harassment by multiple creatures, like they'd developed tactics for dealing with humans who invaded their territory. The smell is something I'll never forget. It was so strong and so wrong that it made me physically sick. I've been around all kinds of wildlife, but nothing smells like what I encountered that night. It was organic, but corrupted somehow, like something that was dying from the inside out. And the sounds they made while they were attacking my trailer, the coordination between them was incredible. One would hit the trailer from one side, then stop and listen while the other one hit from a different angle. They were testing the structure, looking for weak points. I still have that trailer, and you can still see the dents and damage from that night. Sometimes people ask me what happened to it, and I just tell them it was hail damage, because who would believe the real story? But I know what happened at Lake Vesuvius in 2016. I know there are things living in the forests of Ohio that science hasn't classified yet. Things that are smart enough to hunt cooperatively and strong enough to tear apart a travel trailer with their bare hands. And I know they're still out there, waiting for the next solo camper who thinks he's found the perfect isolated spot to spend the night. Because that's exactly what I thought I'd found at Site 16, until I learned that I wasn't alone in those woods at all. Story 6. This happened in September of 2012, when I decided to go on a solo camping trip in the Cascade Mountains near Snoqualmie Pass, Washington. I'd been dealing with a lot of stress at work, and I just needed to get away from everything for a few days, clear my head, you know. I'd done plenty of solo camping before, so it wasn't anything new for me. I drove up Highway 90 until I found this Forest Service road that looked promising. It was one of those unmarked dirt roads that wind up into the mountains, and I followed it for maybe 8 miles until I found a spot that felt right. There was this clearing about a quarter-mile off the main trail, surrounded by thick Douglas firs and hemlocks, perfect for what I wanted: complete isolation. I set up my tent in the middle of the clearing, far enough from the tree line that I'd have a good view of anyone or anything approaching. The weather was perfect, cool but not cold, with just a light breeze moving through the trees. I spent the afternoon hiking around the area, getting familiar with the terrain. The forest up there is incredibly dense. Once you get more than 50 feet from the clearing, the canopy blocks out most of the sunlight and everything gets dark and quiet. It's the kind of place where sound travels weird. Sometimes you'll hear something that seems right next to you, but when you look, there's nothing there. I cooked dinner over my camp stove around 6:30, then spent the evening reading by the light of my headlamp. By 10 o'clock, I was ready for bed. I'd hiked about 12 miles that day, and I was exhausted in that good way you get from physical activity and fresh air. I was sound asleep when I heard the first branch break. It was around 3 in the morning when the sound woke me up. Not a small twig snapping. This was a substantial branch being broken, loud enough to cut through my sleep. I lay there in my sleeping bag, listening, but everything had gone quiet again. Then I heard another one break, then another. The sounds were coming from different directions around my campsite, but they had this rhythm to them that didn't seem natural, like something was deliberately moving through the forest, breaking branches as it went. I unzipped my tent flap and looked outside. The moon was pretty full that night, so I could see the clearing fairly well. Everything looked normal. My camp stove, my pack hanging from the food rope, my boots sitting by the tent entrance. But as I watched, I saw movement at the edge of the tree line. There was this massive figure standing just inside the forest, maybe 30 feet from my tent. At first I thought it might be a bear standing up on its hind legs, but the proportions were all wrong. This thing was at least 8 feet tall, maybe taller, with broad shoulders and long arms. I grabbed my flashlight and switched it on, aiming the beam toward where I'd seen the movement. The light caught the creature full on, and I got my first clear look at it. It was covered in dark hair from head to toe, but the hair looked wet or matted down, like it had been walking through heavy dew. The face was the most disturbing part, definitely more human than animal, but wrong in every way. The features were too large, too pronounced, and the eyes, when my flashlight beam hit them, they reflected back this dull red color. The smell hit me a second later. It was like nothing I'd ever experienced, a combination of wet mold, urine, and something rotten that made my stomach turn. The odor was so strong it felt like it was coating the inside of my nose and throat. I tried to call out, to yell at it, but no sound came out of my mouth. I was completely paralyzed by fear. This thing was staring directly at me through my tent opening, and I could see intelligence in those red eyes. It wasn't just some mindless animal. It was studying me, deciding what to do. Then it tilted its head to one side, like it was curious about something. That simple gesture was somehow more terrifying than if it had roared or charged at me. There was something almost human about the movement, but coming from something that definitely wasn't human. The creature raised its massive hands and began to beat its chest, producing this hollow thumping sound that echoed through the forest. Thump, 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 3 deliberate strikes that seemed to vibrate through the ground. I could feel the impacts in my chest. They were so deep and powerful. That's when my voice finally came back. I let out this scream. Not words, just a raw sound of pure terror. I'd never made a noise like that before in my life. Instead of being startled by my scream, the creature seemed almost pleased. It stopped beating its chest and took 2 steps toward my tent. Each step covered maybe 5 feet, and it moved with this fluid grace that was completely unnatural for something that size. I scrambled backward in my sleeping bag, trying to get as far from the tent opening as possible. The creature was now only about 20 feet away, close enough that I could see details of its face and body that I didn't want to see. Its hands were enormous, easily twice the size of human hands, with thick fingers that ended in what looked like claws. The hair covering its body was coarse and thick, with patches that looked lighter or darker in the flashlight beam. And the face. God, that face. The brow ridge was massive, the jaw jutted out, and the nose was flat and wide like a gorilla's. But the most terrifying thing was how it looked at me. Those eyes held intelligence, awareness, maybe even amusement, like it knew exactly how scared I was and was enjoying it. The creature stopped moving and just stood there, watching me. We stared at each other for what felt like hours, but was probably only 2 or 3 minutes. I was holding my breath, afraid that any movement or sound would trigger it to attack. Then, without any warning, it turned and walked back into the forest. But it didn't walk away like a normal animal would. This thing moved through the dense woods with impossible speed and silence. 1 second it was there in the moonlight, the next second it was gone. No more breaking branches, no rustling of leaves, nothing. It just vanished. I lay there in my tent for another hour, listening to every sound in the forest. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure anything within a mile could hear it. Every snap of a twig, every whisper of wind through the trees had me convinced the creature was coming back. When the sun finally started to come up around 6:30, I got out of my tent to look around the campsite. I needed to see if there was any evidence of what I'd experienced, or if I'd somehow imagined the whole thing. What I found made my blood run cold all over again. There were footprints in the soft dirt at the edge of the clearing. Massive prints, at least 18 inches long and maybe 7 inches wide at the widest point. The impressions were deep, like whatever made them was incredibly heavy, and you could see the outline of individual toes. I put my own boot next to one of the prints for comparison. My size 11 hiking boot looked like a child's shoe next to those massive tracks. The stride length between prints was enormous too, probably 4 feet between steps, which would be impossible for any human. But the most disturbing part was how the tracks showed that the creature had been circling my campsite for some time before I woke up. The prints formed this rough circle around the clearing, maybe 50 feet out from my tent. It had been watching me sleep, walking around and around, studying me. I packed up my gear in record time and hiked back to my truck. The whole way down the trail, I kept looking over my shoulder, convinced that thing was following me. Every shadow between the trees looked like it might be hiding something massive and dark. The drive back to Seattle took about 6 hours, and I didn't stop once. I just wanted to get as far away from those mountains as possible. The whole way home, I kept thinking about those intelligent eyes and wondering what would have happened if the creature had decided to do more than just watch. When I got home, I immediately went online and started researching Sasquatch sightings in the Cascade Mountains. What I found didn't make me feel any better. The area around Snoqualmie Pass has had dozens of encounters over the years, many of them describing creatures that matched exactly what I'd seen. But what really got to me were the reports that mentioned the chest-beating behavior. Apparently, that's something multiple witnesses have described. These creatures drumming on their chests to communicate or intimidate. The fact that my experience matched up with so many others made it impossible to dismiss as imagination or misidentification. I've tried to convince myself over the years that maybe it was just a bear, or maybe I was dreaming, but I know what I saw. The details are too clear, too specific. The smell alone was something no dream could have produced. And those footprints were real enough. I took pictures of them with my phone before I left the campsite. The experience changed how I think about the wilderness completely. I used to love the idea of being alone in remote areas. But now I can't shake the feeling that I'm never really alone out there. Something is always watching from the shadows, deciding whether I'm worth investigating. I've been back to the Cascades many times since then, but never alone, and never to that specific area. Part of me is curious to see if I could find that creature again, but a bigger part of me knows that was a one-time encounter I was lucky to survive. Sometimes I wonder what it wanted. Why did it spend time circling my camp? Was it just curious about this strange human sleeping alone in its territory? Or was it considering something more aggressive before deciding I wasn't worth the trouble? The fact that it beat its chest and then approached my tent suggests it was trying to communicate something. Maybe it was a warning, letting me know that I was in its domain and could be removed if necessary. Or maybe it was just testing my reaction, seeing if I was a threat or prey. What disturbs me most is how human-like its behavior was. The head tilt, the way it studied my reaction to its chest beating, the deliberate approach to my tent. That all suggests a level of intelligence that's frankly terrifying. This wasn't some mindless beast acting on instinct. And the way it disappeared into the forest shows how perfectly adapted these creatures are to their environment. Something that size should make noise moving through dense woods, but it vanished without a sound. That kind of stealth ability, combined with their obvious intelligence and physical power, makes them the perfect apex predator. I still camp and hike, but I'm much more careful now about where I go and what precautions I take. I never camp alone anymore, and I always make sure someone knows exactly where I'll be and when I plan to return. Because somewhere in the mountains of Washington, there are things that most people refuse to believe exist, and they're perfectly capable of making someone disappear without a trace. That night, near Snoqualmie Pass, taught me that we're not at the top of the food chain in the deep wilderness. There are things out there that are bigger, stronger, and smarter than us, and they've been avoiding human contact by choice, not because they're afraid of us. I was lucky that night. Whatever that creature's intentions were, it chose to walk away rather than escalate the situation. But I'll never forget those red eyes staring at me through my tent opening, or the intelligence I saw there, because next time I might not be so lucky. Story 7. This happened in October of 2008 when I was up in Algonquin Provincial Park in Ontario. I'd driven up there for some late-season fishing, the kind of trip I'd been taking for years, just me and my canoe, trying to catch some big northern pike before the water got too cold. I'd launched my canoe on Lake Opeongo around noon that day. It's a massive lake, over 30 miles long, and I was heading for this isolated bay on the north shore that hardly anyone ever fishes. The locals told me it was where the really big pike liked to hang out, especially in the fall when they were feeding heavily before winter. The weather was perfect for October, cool but not cold, with just enough wind to keep the bugs down. The leaves were at peak color, all those brilliant reds and oranges reflected in the dark water. It was exactly the kind of peaceful day I'd been looking forward to all week. I'd been fishing for maybe 4 hours when the sun started getting low in the sky. I was working my way along the shoreline, casting toward fallen logs and weed beds where pike like to ambush smaller fish. The fishing had been decent. I'd caught a few smaller ones and released them, but nothing trophy-sized yet. That's when I heard the scream. It came from somewhere on the north shore, maybe a quarter-mile away from where I was fishing. At first I thought it might be a loon. They make some pretty wild sounds, especially during mating season, but this was different. This was a high-pitched, almost human-sounding shriek that went on for maybe 10 seconds. The sound gave me chills instantly. I've spent a lot of time in the Canadian wilderness, and I know what all the common animals sound like. This wasn't a loon, wasn't a wolf, wasn't an elk bugling. This was something I'd never heard before, and it sounded angry or distressed. I stopped fishing and listened, but everything had gone quiet again. Even the wind seemed to have died down, leaving the lake surface perfectly still. That's when I made the mistake of deciding to investigate. I paddled closer to the shore where the scream had come from, thinking maybe there was an injured animal that needed help, or maybe another fisherman in trouble. The bay was surrounded by thick forest, mostly maple and birch with some pine mixed in. The shoreline was rocky with fallen trees extending out into the water. I was maybe 50 yards from shore when I saw movement in the trees. Something large was moving through the forest, pushing through the underbrush near the water's edge. I grabbed my binoculars to get a better look. That's when I saw it. There was this huge figure crouched down by the water, drinking. At first glance, it looked like it might be a really big black bear, but as I watched, it stood up to its full height, and I realized this was no bear. The thing was at least 7.5 feet tall, maybe 8 feet. It was covered in reddish-brown hair that looked thick and matted, like it hadn't been groomed in months. The body structure was completely wrong for any animal I knew, too upright, too human-like, but way too big and muscular. When it lifted its head from the water, our eyes met across the distance. The face was the most disturbing thing I've ever seen. It was almost human, but wrong in every possible way. The features were too large, too pronounced. Heavy brow ridge, flat nose, jutting jaw. But the eyes, those eyes were what really got to me. They were intelligent, aware, studying me just as intently as I was studying it. For maybe 30 seconds, we just stared at each other. I was sitting motionless in my canoe, afraid to move, afraid to breathe, while this creature stood waist-deep in the lake water, dripping from its chin, just watching me. Then it started to stand up fully, rising out of the water like some kind of nightmare. Water was cascading off its massive frame, and I could see the incredible size of its shoulders and arms. The proportions were all wrong. The arms were way too long, hanging down almost to its knees. That's when I tried to back-paddle away from the shore. But in my panic, I hit a submerged rock with my paddle. The impact made a loud scraping noise that echoed across the water. The sound seemed to irritate the creature. It pulled its lips back, showing these huge yellowish teeth, and let out a low growl that I felt in my chest. Then it started walking toward me through the water. The thing moved through the lake like it was walking on solid ground. The water that came up to my canoe's gunwales only reached its waist. Each step it took covered maybe 4 feet, and it was moving with purpose, heading directly toward me. I started paddling frantically, trying to get to deeper water where it couldn't follow. But as it got closer, I could see how powerful this thing was. Its shoulders were massive, probably 3 times broader than a normal person's. The muscles in its arms and chest were clearly defined, even under all that hair. The creature followed me parallel to the shoreline for maybe 200 yards. It wasn't running or thrashing through the water, just walking steadily, keeping pace with my frantic paddling, like it was herding me, pushing me towards some specific part of the lake. That's when I realized what was happening. It was driving me toward a shallow area where the water was only knee-deep. If I got stuck there, I'd be completely at its mercy. I changed direction and paddled as hard as I could toward the center of the lake, toward the deepest water I could find. Behind me, I could hear the creature splashing, hitting the water with what sounded like frustration. When I finally looked back, it had stopped following and was standing in the shallows, watching me paddle away. Then it opened its mouth and let out another one of those terrible screams, longer and louder than the first one. The sound echoed across the entire lake, bouncing off the far shores. I kept paddling until I was at least half a mile from shore before I stopped to catch my breath. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the paddle. I'd never been so terrified in my life. From that distance, I could still see the creature standing in the water, but it had stopped trying to follow me. It just stood there for maybe 10 minutes, occasionally moving up and down the shoreline before finally disappearing back into the forest. The sun was setting by then, and I had about an hour of daylight left to get back to the boat launch. I'd never paddled so hard in my life. Every stroke was motivated by pure fear. I just wanted to get off that lake and back to civilization as fast as possible. When I finally reached the launch area, I was exhausted but too wired to rest. I loaded my canoe onto my truck and drove straight to the park office to report what I'd seen. But when I got there, it was closed for the day. I ended up driving to the nearest town, Huntsville, and stopping at the first bar I could find. I needed a drink, needed to talk to someone about what I'd experienced. But when I tried to tell the locals about the creature I'd encountered, they just looked at me like I was crazy. One old-timer at the bar said he'd heard similar stories over the years, but most people dismissed them as tall tales told by fishermen who'd had too much to drink. He said the Algonquin area had always had legends about wild men living in the deep forests, but nobody took them seriously anymore. I went back to my motel room that night, but I didn't sleep much. Every time I closed my eyes, I could see that creature's face staring at me across the water. Those intelligent eyes, the way it had strategically tried to herd me towards shallow water. That wasn't random animal behavior. That was calculated, predatory thinking. The next morning, I drove back to the park, partly because I needed to process what had happened, partly because I wanted to see if there was any evidence of the encounter. I didn't go back out on the lake. I was too scared for that. But I hiked along the shore to the area where I'd seen the creature. What I found made my blood run cold all over again. There were footprints in the muddy shoreline, massive prints, at least 16 inches long and maybe 8 inches wide at the ball of the foot. The impressions were deep, showing just how heavy whatever made them must have been. But what really got to me was the pattern of the prints. They showed that the creature had been walking back and forth along that stretch of shoreline for some time, like it had been patrolling the area, maybe watching for fishermen or other visitors to the lake. I took pictures of the prints with my phone, but when I got home and tried to show them to people, everyone had explanations. Bare prints that got distorted by water. Hoax footprints made by someone playing a joke. Nobody wanted to consider that they might be evidence of something unknown. I'd been fishing in Ontario for over 30 years, and I'd never experienced anything like what happened at Lake Opeongo. I've seen bears, moose, wolves, every kind of wildlife that's supposed to live up there, but this was something completely different. The intelligence I saw in those eyes still haunts me. This wasn't some dumb animal reacting on instinct. It was thinking, planning, making strategic decisions about how to deal with me. The way it tried to drive me into shallow water showed a level of problem-solving ability that's frankly terrifying. And the physical capabilities were incredible. Walking through water that would have been chest-deep on me like it was just a puddle. Moving with coordination and grace despite its massive size. The strength must have been unbelievable. I could see the muscle definition even under all that hair. But what bothers me most is how perfectly it seemed adapted to that environment. The way it moved through the forest without making any noise until it wanted to. The way it could disappear back into the trees so quickly. This thing had been living in those woods for a long time, and it knew every inch of the territory. I've done research since then, looking into other Sasquatch sightings in the Algonquin area, and I'm not the only one who's had encounters up there. There are reports going back decades of similar creatures being spotted around the remote lakes and rivers. Most of the reports describe the same basic features: massive size, reddish-brown hair, human-like but exaggerated facial features, incredible strength and intelligence. And many of them mention the creatures being associated with water, either fishing or drinking from lakes and streams. What strikes me about these reports is how consistent they are. If people were just making up stories, you'd expect more variation in the details. But encounter after encounter describes essentially the same creature, behaving in similar ways. I've been back to Algonquin Park several times since that day, but never to Lake Opeongo. I stick to the smaller, more populated lakes now, and I never fish alone. The experience changed my whole relationship with the wilderness. I used to think humans were the dominant species in any environment we entered, but that day on the lake taught me that there are things out there that are bigger, stronger, and potentially smarter than us. Things that have been avoiding human contact, not because they're afraid of us, but because they choose to stay hidden. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd gotten stuck in those shallow waters. Would the creature have just investigated me out of curiosity, or did it have more aggressive intentions? The way it had herded me toward that area suggested it had a plan, and I'm not sure I would have liked how that plan ended. The scream it let out when I escaped still gives me chills when I think about it. There was so much emotion in that sound, frustration, anger, maybe even disappointment, like it had been anticipating something that I'd denied it by getting away. I still fish, and I still love spending time in the Canadian wilderness, but I'm much more careful now about where I go and what precautions I take. Because somewhere in the remote forests of Ontario, there are things that most people refuse to believe exist, and they're perfectly capable of making someone disappear without a trace. That day at Lake Opeongo taught me that we're not alone out there, and we're not necessarily at the top of the food chain either. There are older, wilder things sharing those forests with us, and they've been watching us a lot longer than we've been watching them. Story 8. This happened in July of 2014 when I was hiking solo in the Black Hills near Deadwood, South Dakota. I'd driven up from Denver for a long weekend, planning to explore some of the less traveled trails in the area. It was my third day there, and I'd been having an amazing time just getting away from everything and reconnecting with nature. I'd been staying at a campground outside of Deadwood, but during the day, I'd drive to different trailheads and spend hours hiking the backcountry. The Black Hills are incredible, all these pine-covered ridges and rocky formations that make you feel like you're in some ancient, untouched wilderness. That particular day, I'd started early from this unmarked trailhead I'd found on a Forest Service road. The trail wasn't on any of the official maps, which made it perfect for what I wanted, complete solitude. I'd been hiking for maybe 4 hours, climbing up through dense pine forest toward what looked like a rocky outcrop where I could get some good views. It was around noon when I stopped to rest at this formation of granite boulders. The weather was perfect, warm but not hot, with just enough breeze to keep me comfortable. I was sitting on a flat rock, drinking water and eating a granola bar when I first noticed the smell. It started as just this faint odor carried on the wind, kind of like sulfur mixed with wet dog. At first I thought maybe there was a natural spring nearby with some mineral content that was causing the smell, but as I sat there it got stronger and more unpleasant. That's when I looked up and saw something watching me from the ridge above. There was this massive silhouette standing on a rocky outcrop about 50 yards uphill from where I was resting. At first I thought it might be another hiker, but something about the size and shape seemed wrong. This figure was way too big and bulky to be a normal person. I pulled out my binoculars to get a better look, and that's when I realized what I was seeing wasn't human at all. The thing was easily 8 feet tall, maybe even bigger. It was covered in black hair that seemed to shine in the midday sun, thick and coarse-looking. The body structure was incredible. Massive shoulders, arms that hung down almost to its knees, and a torso that looked like it belonged on a professional bodybuilder, but scaled up to impossible proportions. But it was the face that really got my attention. Even at 50 yards, I could see it clearly through my binoculars. It was definitely more human than animal, but wrong in every possible way. Heavy brow ridge, flat nose, jutting jaw. And the eyes, they were this deep brown color, and they were staring directly at me with obvious intelligence. For maybe 30 seconds, we just looked at each other. I was too shocked to move, and the creature seemed content to just study me from its position on the ridge. Then it did something that absolutely terrified me. It tilted its head to one side, like it was curious about something, and started making these clicking sounds, not random noise. There was definitely a pattern to it, like it was trying to communicate. The sounds echoed off the rock formations around us, creating this weird, almost musical quality. That's when I realized I was completely alone in the middle of nowhere with something that shouldn't exist, and nobody knew where I was or when I'd be back. The isolation that I'd been loving all weekend suddenly felt like a death trap. The creature started moving down the slope toward me. It wasn't running or being aggressive, just walking with this casual, confident gait that covered ground incredibly fast. Each step it took probably covered 4 or 5 feet, and it moved over the rocky terrain like it was walking on flat pavement. I stood up from my resting spot and started backing away, but I kept my movements slow and non-threatening. I'd heard that sudden movements could trigger predatory responses in wild animals, and I had no idea what might set this thing off. When it got to within about 20 feet of me, it stopped and just stood there, studying me. Up close, the size was even more incredible. This thing was massive, probably close to 8.5 feet tall, and built like it could tear a tree out of the ground with its bare hands. The smell was overwhelming now. That sulfur and wet dog odor, but mixed with something else that was organic and rotten. It was so strong, it made my eyes water and my stomach turn. I had to breathe through my mouth to keep from gagging. But the most terrifying moment came when it reached down and picked up this rock that had to weigh at least 50 pounds. It held the rock in one hand like it was a tennis ball, then slowly crushed it into pieces. The sound of the granite cracking and crumbling echoed through the forest. The message was crystal clear. This thing could do the same thing to my skull without breaking a sweat. After it dropped the rock fragments at its feet, it took one step forward. Just one step, but it brought the creature close enough that I could see individual hairs on its face, could see the intelligence in those brown eyes, could see the incredible muscle definition in its arms and chest. We stood there for what felt like hours, but was probably only 2 or 3 minutes. The creature seemed to be evaluating me, deciding what to do next. I was trying not to show fear, but inside I was absolutely terrified. This thing could have killed me in seconds if it wanted to. Then, without any warning or apparent reason, it turned around and started walking back up the slope. But it didn't just walk away. It climbed that steep, rocky hillside with impossible speed and agility. It was moving over terrain that would have taken me an hour to navigate, and it covered the distance in maybe 2 minutes. When it reached the top of the ridge, it stopped and looked back at me one more time, then disappeared over the crest. I stood there for another 10 minutes, listening to my heart pound and trying to process what had just happened. Then I packed up my gear and hiked back to the trailhead as fast as I could move. I kept looking over my shoulder the whole way, convinced that thing was following me through the trees. When I got back to my truck, I sat in the cab for a long time, just trying to calm down and figure out what to do next. Part of me wanted to drive straight to the sheriff's office in Deadwood and report what I'd seen. But another part of me knew how that would go. They'd either think I was crazy or assume I'd been drinking. I ended up driving back to my campsite and spending the rest of the day researching Bigfoot sightings in the Black Hills area. What I found didn't make me feel any better. Turns out the region has a long history of encounters with large, hair-covered creatures. There were dozens of reports going back decades, many describing creatures that matched exactly what I'd seen. But what really got to me were the details that multiple witnesses mentioned. The sulfur smell, the incredible size and strength, the obvious intelligence, the way the creatures seemed to evaluate humans before deciding whether to approach or retreat. My experience wasn't unique, it was part of a pattern. I didn't sleep much that night. Every sound outside my tent had me sitting up and listening. When I finally did drift off, I had nightmares about those brown eyes staring at me and those massive hands crushing rocks like they were made of clay. The next morning, I hiked back to the area where the encounter had happened. I needed to see if there was any physical evidence, any proof that I hadn't imagined the whole thing. What I found made my blood run cold all over again. There were footprints in a patch of soft dirt near where the creature had been standing. Massive prints, easily 18 inches long and at least 8 inches wide. The impressions were deep, showing just how heavy whatever made them must have been. And you could see the outline of individual toes, complete with what looked like claw marks at the tips. I also found the remains of the rock it had crushed. The granite fragments were scattered over a wide area, some pieces driven several inches into the ground by the force of the creature's grip. I tried to estimate how much strength it would take to crush solid rock like that, and the numbers were terrifying. But the most disturbing find was a patch of hair caught on a pine branch at about 8 feet off the ground. The hair was thick and black, coarser than any animal hair I'd ever seen. I took a sample and sealed it in a plastic bag, thinking maybe I could have it analyzed later. I never did have that hair tested. When I got home and really thought about it, I realized I didn't want confirmation of what I'd experienced. Part of me was still hoping I could convince myself it had all been some kind of hallucination or misidentification. But the memories are too clear, too detailed. The way that creature moved, the intelligence in its eyes, the casual demonstration of strength when it crushed that rock, those aren't the kind of details your brain makes up. I've been back to the Black Hills several times since then, but never to that specific area. Part of me is curious to see if I could encounter the creature again, but a bigger part of me knows that I was lucky the first time. The next meeting might not end with it just walking away. What bothers me most about the experience is how the creature seemed to be evaluating me, the head tilt, the clicking sounds, the way it stepped closer to get a better look. That was intelligent, curious behavior. It was studying me just as much as I was studying it. And the rock crushing demonstration felt like a deliberate message. It wasn't showing off or being randomly destructive. It was communicating something. Maybe warning me about what could happen if I posed a threat, or maybe just showing me how outmatched I was in that situation. The casual way it climbed back up that rocky slope still amazes me. Something that size should be clumsy and slow, but this creature moved with incredible grace and coordination. It was perfectly adapted to that mountainous terrain, probably more at home in the Black Hills than I could ever be. I've done a lot of research since then on Sasquatch behavior and intelligence, and what I've learned suggests these creatures are far more sophisticated than most people realize. They seem to have complex social structures, advanced problem-solving abilities, and a deep understanding of their environment. The fact that they've managed to avoid scientific documentation for so long, despite numerous sightings, suggests they're incredibly intelligent and strategic about human contact. They seem to know exactly how to stay hidden when they want to, and only reveal themselves when they choose to. I think that's what happened to me that day in the Black Hills. For whatever reason, that creature decided to make contact. Maybe it was curious about this lone human wandering through its territory. Maybe it was establishing dominance or marking boundaries. Or maybe it was just evaluating whether I posed a threat to its family or community. The clicking sounds it made still puzzle me. There was definitely a pattern there, like it was trying to communicate something specific. I've listened to recordings of various animal vocalizations, but nothing matches what I heard that day. It was unlike anything in the natural world that I'm aware of. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd tried to respond to those clicking sounds. Would the creature have attempted further communication, or would it have interpreted any response as aggressive behavior and reacted accordingly? I'll never know the answers to those questions, but I know one thing for certain. There are things living in the remote mountains of South Dakota that science hasn't classified yet. Things that are intelligent, powerful, and perfectly capable of eliminating threats to their secrecy. That encounter changed my whole perspective on wilderness hiking. I used to think the biggest dangers were weather, injury, or getting lost. Now I know there are other considerations. Ancient residents of these mountains who've been watching human visitors a lot longer than we've been watching them. I still hike solo sometimes, but I'm much more aware of my surroundings now. I pay attention to unusual smells, unexplained sounds, and that feeling of being watched that sometimes comes over you in deep wilderness. Because somewhere out there in the Black Hills, something is still watching, still evaluating, still deciding whether the next encounter will end as peacefully as mine did. Story 9. This happened in August of 2011 when I was up in Denali National Park in Alaska. I'd flown up from Seattle specifically to photograph wildlife. It was something I'd been planning for over a year. Denali in late summer is supposed to be incredible for wildlife photography. especially if you're trying to capture shots of bears, caribou, and other large mammals. I'd been in the park for 3 days, camping at the Teclanica River campground and spending my days hiking to different photography spots. The weather had been perfect, clear skies, decent temperatures, and just enough wildlife activity to keep me busy. I was using a pretty serious setup, professional camera body with a 600mm telephoto lens, tripod, the whole works. On my 4th day, I decided to try this spot I'd heard about from another photographer, a bend in the Teclanica River where bears supposedly came to fish for salmon in the early morning. I set up my hide about a 1/4 mile upstream from the campground in this thick stand of willows that would give me good cover while I waited for bears to show up. I was up before dawn, hiking to the spot in complete darkness, with just my headlamp to guide me. By the time I had my camera set up and my hide camouflaged, it was maybe 4:30 in the morning. The sun wouldn't be up for another hour, but I wanted to be ready in case any bears showed up early. The morning was absolutely perfect for photography. There was this thick fog rolling off the river, creating these amazing atmospheric conditions. The water was running pretty high from recent rains, and you could hear salmon jumping everywhere. It was exactly the kind of scene I'd come to Alaska to capture. Around 5 in the morning, just as the sky was starting to lighten up, I heard something big moving through the brush on the opposite side of the river. I figured it was probably a grizzly coming down to fish, so I got my camera ready and started scanning the far bank through my telephoto lens. Through the fog, I could see this large dark shape moving along the riverbank. At first, I thought it was exactly what I was hoping for, a big brown bear heading to the water, but as I watched through my lens, something seemed off about the way it was moving. The shape was too upright, too human-like in its movements. Bears will stand on their hind legs sometimes, but they don't walk that way for extended periods. This thing was moving bipedally along the bank, and it was covering ground with these long, fluid strides. I adjusted my telephoto lens to get a clearer view, and that's when I realized I wasn't looking at a bear at all. The creature was massive, easily 9 feet tall, maybe even bigger. It was covered in thick, grayish-brown hair that looked almost silver in the early morning light. The build was incredible, broad shoulders, heavily muscled arms, and a torso that looked like it belonged on the world's strongest man, but scaled up to impossible proportions. But what really got my attention was how skillfully it was fishing. This thing was standing waist-deep in the fast-moving river, using its hands to catch salmon with incredible precision. It would stand perfectly still, waiting for a fish to swim close, then grab it out of the water with movements so quick they were almost too fast to follow through my camera lens. I started taking pictures as fast as my camera would fire. This was the discovery of a lifetime. Clear photographic evidence of a Sasquatch in its natural habitat. My hands were shaking with excitement as I fired shot after shot through the telephoto lens. Then the creature noticed me. I was maybe 200 yards away, hidden in thick brush, using a long lens. There should have been no way for it to detect my presence, but suddenly it stopped fishing and turned to look directly at my position. Our eyes met through the camera lens, and what I saw in those golden-colored eyes made my blood run cold. There was intelligence there, awareness, and something that looked almost like amusement. Like it had known I was there all along and had been putting on a show for my benefit. The creature dropped the salmon it had been holding and started walking across the river toward me. The water that had been chest-deep on me only came up to its waist. Each step it took covered maybe 4 feet, and it moved through the fast current like it was walking on solid ground. I kept taking pictures, but my excitement was quickly turning to fear. This thing was coming straight toward me, and I was completely alone in the middle of the Alaskan wilderness. The nearest help was miles away, and nobody knew exactly where I'd gone that morning. When the creature reached my side of the river, it stopped at the water's edge and just stared at me. Even at 150 yards, the size was intimidating. This wasn't just big, It was built on a completely different scale than anything human. The shoulders were probably 4 feet across, and the arms looked like they could tear a tree out of the ground. I tried to keep taking pictures, but my hands were shaking so badly now that I couldn't keep the camera steady. The creature seemed to notice my nervousness and tilted its head like it was studying my reaction. Then it did something that absolutely terrified me. It reached over to my camera equipment, my spare lens, my tripod bag, some other gear I'd left sitting on a rock about 15 feet from where I was hiding. The creature picked up my backup camera lens with one finger like it was examining it, turning it over in its massive hand. I was close enough now to see details that I really didn't want to see. The hands were enormous, easily twice the size of human hands, with thick fingers that ended in dark, curved nails. The face was a disturbing mixture of human and ape features, intelligent golden eyes, a flat nose, and when it opened its mouth slightly, I could see huge yellowed teeth. The creature gently set my lens back down where it had found it, then looked directly at me again. For maybe 30 seconds, we just stared at each other. I was too scared to move, too fascinated to look away. Then, without any warning, it opened its mouth and let out this roar that I felt in my chest cavity. The sound was incredible, deeper and louder than any bear I'd ever heard, with this harmonic quality that seemed to echo off the mountains around us. The roar was so sudden and so powerful that it startled me backward. I lost my footing and fell over, landing hard on the rocky ground behind my hide. When I scrambled back to my feet and looked toward the river, the creature was gone, just completely vanished, like it had never been there at all. I spent the next hour searching the area with my camera lens, looking for any sign of where it had gone, but there was nothing, no movement in the brush, no splashing in the water, no indication of which direction it had traveled. When I finally worked up the courage to leave my hide and check on my equipment, everything was exactly where I'd left it. The lens the creature had examined showed no signs of being handled. No scratches, no fingerprints, nothing. But here's the thing that still gives me chills. When I got back to my hotel that evening and tried to download the pictures from my memory card, every single file was corrupted. Not just blurry or poorly exposed, completely corrupted, showing nothing but digital static and random pixels. I had taken maybe 200 shots of that creature, and not one of them was recoverable. The camera had been working perfectly before and after the encounter, but every image from that specific time period was destroyed. I tried everything: professional data recovery services, specialized software, even sending the memory card to the camera manufacturer. Nothing worked. It was like something had deliberately wiped those files while leaving all my other photos intact. The technical explanation doesn't make sense. Memory cards don't just randomly corrupt specific files while leaving others untouched. And the corruption pattern was too perfect, too complete. Every single frame from the encounter was gone, but pictures I'd taken an hour before and an hour after were fine. I ended up leaving Denali 3 weeks earlier than planned. The experience had shaken me so badly that I couldn't focus on photography anymore. Every time I set up my camera equipment, I'd start thinking about those golden eyes staring at me and that incredible roar echoing off the mountains. The flight home gave me time to think about what had happened, and the more I thought about it, the more disturbed I became. The creature had known I was there from the beginning. The way it had looked directly at my position, the deliberate way it had approached me, the casual examination of my equipment. It felt like I'd been tested somehow, like the whole encounter had been orchestrated by something with intelligence far beyond what I'd expected. The fishing demonstration, the approach to my position, even the gentle handling of my camera lens. It all seemed calculated to show me specific things. And the timing of that roar was perfect. It had waited until I was completely focused on watching it, then delivered this overwhelming sensory experience that left me disoriented and vulnerable. By the time I recovered, it had vanished without a trace. I've done a lot of research since then on Sasquatch encounters in Alaska, and the Denali area has a long history of sightings, but most of the reports I've found describe brief glimpses or distant observations. What I experienced was different. This was prolonged, intimate contact with something that clearly didn't want to remain hidden. The intelligence I witnessed still haunts me. The way that creature had examined my camera equipment showed curiosity and understanding about human technology. It knew what those objects were for, knew they were important to me, and chose to interact with them in a non-threatening way. But the message was clear. It could have destroyed my equipment, could have destroyed me, but chose not to. I was being shown the extent of its power while being treated with something that almost felt like respect. The corrupted memory card bothers me most of all. I've never found a satisfactory explanation for how those files were destroyed so selectively. It's almost like something wanted to ensure I had no proof of the encounter while leaving me with the memory of what I'd experienced. Sometimes I wonder if that was part of the test, seeing if I would try to profit from the encounter or exploit it somehow. Maybe the corruption was a way of ensuring I'd be left with just the experience itself, without any way to prove it to others. I still do wildlife photography, but I've never been back to Alaska. Part of me wants to return to that spot on the Teclanica River to see if I could encounter that creature again. But a bigger part of me knows that lightning doesn't strike twice, and I was incredibly lucky the first time. What I experienced that morning changed my whole understanding of what's possible in the remote wilderness. There are things out there that are far more intelligent and sophisticated than we realize, things that have been watching human activity for who knows how long. The casual way that creature had fished for salmon showed it was perfectly at home in that environment. This wasn't some lost or confused animal. It was a native resident of the Denali ecosystem, probably with generations of knowledge about living in that harsh landscape. And the fact that it chose to reveal itself to me suggests these creatures have their own reasons for making contact sometimes. Maybe curiosity about human technology, maybe territorial behavior, or maybe something more complex that I can't even guess at. I'll never forget those golden eyes staring at me through my camera lens, or the casual way it had picked up my equipment to examine it. There was recognition there, understanding of what I was doing and why I was there. It knew I was documenting wildlife, and for whatever reason, it decided to let itself be documented, at least temporarily. But the corrupted files make it clear that the encounter was on its terms, not mine. I was allowed to witness something extraordinary, but not to profit from it or use it to prove anything to the outside world. The experience was meant for me alone. That morning in Denali taught me that we're not alone in the wilderness, and we're definitely not the most intelligent species out there. Somewhere in the remote mountains of Alaska, there are things watching us, evaluating us, and occasionally choosing to make contact on their own terms. Story 10. This happened in May of 2013 when I was exploring caves in the Ozark Mountains near Buffalo River in Arkansas. I'm not a professional spelunker or anything, just someone who's always been fascinated by underground formations and hidden spaces. I'd been cave exploring as a hobby for about 10 years, always solo, because I liked the solitude and the challenge of navigating these underground worlds on my own. I'd driven down from Missouri for a long weekend, planning to explore some of the lesser-known cave systems in the area. The Ozarks are full of limestone caves, many of them unmapped and unexplored. That's exactly what draws me to the region, the possibility of finding something that no other human has ever seen. On my second day there, I was hiking along this ridge above Buffalo River when I spotted what looked like a cave entrance, hidden behind some thick vegetation. It wasn't marked on any of my maps, wasn't mentioned in any of the caving guides I'd studied. Just this dark opening in the limestone cliff face, maybe 4 feet high and 3 feet wide. The entrance was partially concealed by fallen rocks and overgrown vines, like nature had been trying to hide it for years. I had to clear away a bunch of debris just to get a good look inside. When I shined my headlamp into the opening, I could see that it opened up into a larger chamber beyond the narrow entrance. This was exactly the kind of discovery I lived for, an unmapped cave system that might contain formations nobody had ever documented. I checked my gear, made sure my backup lights were working, and squeezed through the entrance. The first chamber was small, maybe 20 feet across, with a low ceiling that forced me to crouch down. But there was definitely a passage leading deeper into the cave system. The air felt cool and humid, with that distinctive earthy smell that you get in limestone caves. I spent about an hour crawling through narrow passages, following the cave system as it twisted deeper into the mountain. The passages were tight in some places. I had to take off my pack and push it ahead of me to get through some of the narrower spots. Then I reached this section where the passage suddenly opened up into what felt like a much larger space. My headlamp beam couldn't reach the far walls or the ceiling, which meant I was in a significant cavern. This was the kind of discovery that made all the crawling and scraping worth it. I worked my way across the chamber, mapping it in my head and looking for interesting formations. That's when I found the bones. At first, I thought they might be animal remains, deer bones or maybe bear bones from some creature that had died in the cave years ago. But as I examined them more closely with my headlamp, I realized there were way too many bones scattered around, and they were arranged in patterns that didn't look natural. Some of the bones looked human-sized, but others were much larger. Femur bones that were easily twice as long as human leg bones, and skulls that were way too big to belong to any known animal. There were also smaller bones mixed in, like maybe from rabbits or raccoons, but what really disturbed me was what looked like a nest made of branches and moss in the center of the chamber. It was huge, maybe 8 feet across, and raised up about 3 feet off the cave floor. The construction was too organized, too purposeful to be random debris that had washed in during floods. That's when I heard the growl. It started low, almost subsonic, like a sound you feel in your chest more than hear with your ears. The growl was coming from somewhere deeper in the cave, from a passage I hadn't noticed before. As the sound got louder, I realized something was in there with me, and it was big. I turned toward the sound and saw this massive shape moving in the darkness beyond my headlamp beam. At first, it was just a shadow, but as it got closer, I could make out more details. Whatever was coming toward me was huge, easily 7 feet tall, even though it was crouched down to fit in the cave passage. The thing was covered in grayish-black hair that looked matted and dirty. In the confined space of the cave, the smell hit me like a physical blow, a combination of decay, musk, and something organic that made my stomach turn. It was like being trapped in a room with a rotting animal carcass. When the creature reached the main chamber where I was standing, it straightened up to its full height. The ceiling was high enough that it didn't have to stoop, and I got my first clear look at what I was dealing with. This thing was massive, probably close to 8 feet tall, and built like it could tear a person apart without any effort. The face was a nightmare mixture of human and animal features. Heavy brow ridge, flat nose, and when it opened its mouth, I could see these huge canine teeth that were yellowed and broken. The hands were what really terrified me. They were enormous, easily twice the size of human hands, with thick fingers that ended in what looked like claws, dark, curved nails that were probably 4 inches long and looked sharp enough to slice through flesh like paper. The creature and I stared at each other for what felt like hours, but was probably only 30 seconds. I was completely frozen with fear, unable to move or even breathe properly. This thing was blocking the only exit I knew about, and I was trapped in an underground chamber with something that could kill me in seconds. That's when it started moving toward me, not running or charging, just walking with this deliberate, predatory gait that covered ground fast, despite the careful placement of each step. It was studying me as it approached, tilting its head like it was trying to figure out what I was and what I was doing in its cave, I started backing up toward the far wall of the chamber, but there was nowhere to go. The cave walls were solid limestone, and the only passages I could see were too small for me to crawl through quickly. I was completely trapped. When the creature got to within about 10 feet of me, it stopped and made this sniffing sound, like it was trying to identify my scent. The noise was incredibly loud in the enclosed space, echoing off the cave walls and seeming to come from all directions at once. Then it did something that absolutely terrified me. It reached out toward me with one of those massive clawed hands, moving slowly like it was being careful not to startle me. The gesture was almost gentle, but the implied threat was obvious. Those claws could have opened me up from neck to stomach with one swipe. I pressed myself against the cave wall, trying to make myself as small as possible. The creature's hand stopped maybe 6 inches from my face, and I could see every detail of those dark claws, could smell the decay that seemed to cling to its fur. We stayed like that for several minutes, me pressed against the wall, the creature reaching toward me but not quite making contact. It was like some kind of standoff, both of us trying to figure out what the other was going to do next. Then, for reasons I still can't understand, the creature slowly lowered its hand and stepped back. It didn't retreat completely, just gave me some space while continuing to watch me with those deep-set eyes. I could see intelligence there, calculation, like it was making some kind of decision about what to do with me. After what felt like an eternity, the creature turned and walked back toward the passage where it had first appeared. But instead of disappearing back into the darkness, it stopped at the entrance and looked back at me one more time. Then it moved to one side, clearing the path to the main exit. The message was crystal clear. I was being given permission to leave. This thing could have killed me easily, but for whatever reason, it had decided to let me go. The gesture was unmistakable. It was showing me the way out. I didn't need to be told twice. I grabbed my pack and started moving toward the exit as quickly as I could, without making any sudden movements that might change its mind. The creature watched me the entire time, but it didn't try to stop me or follow me. I squeezed back through that narrow entrance passage faster than I've ever moved through a cave before. I could hear my heart pounding in my ears, could feel adrenaline making my hands shake as I crawled through the tight spots. All I wanted was to get out of that cave and back into sunlight. When I finally emerged from the entrance, I didn't stop running until I reached my truck. I threw my gear in the back and drove away from that area as fast as I could, not stopping until I was back on the main highway toward Missouri. The drive home gave me time to think about what I'd experienced, and the more I thought about it, the more disturbed I became. That cave wasn't just some random underground space. It was being used as a den or nest by something that definitely wasn't supposed to exist. The bones scattered around the chamber, the constructed nest, the way the creature had territorial knowledge of the cave system, all of that suggested I'd stumbled into the home of something that had been living there for a long time. But what bothers me most is the intelligence I witnessed. The way that creature had evaluated me, made a conscious decision to let me live, then deliberately shown me the way out. That wasn't instinctual animal behavior. That was reasoning, problem-solving, maybe even compassion. I never reported what I found in that cave. Who would I report it to? And what would I say? That I'd discovered evidence of Sasquatch living in unmapped caves in the Ozark Mountains. They'd either think I was crazy or assume I was trying to get attention. But I also never went back to that area. I sealed up my maps of the cave entrance location and put them away where I'd never be tempted to return. Some places are meant to stay hidden, and whatever lives in that cave has every right to its privacy. I still go caving, but I'm much more careful now about the caves I choose to explore. I stick to well-documented systems with multiple entrances, places where I'm unlikely to stumble into someone else's home. Because that's what I realized I'd done. I'd broken into something's house, and been fortunate enough to encounter a resident that chose to evict me peacefully rather than violently. The smell is what I remember most vividly. That combination of decay and musk that filled the confined space of the cave. It was organic, but wrong somehow, like something that had been living underground for so long that it had taken on the characteristics of the cave itself. And those claws, I still have nightmares about how easily they could have torn through flesh and bone. The fact that the creature had restrained itself, had chosen not to use those natural weapons, suggests a level of self-control that's frankly remarkable. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd tried to communicate with it somehow. Would it have responded? Could we have established some kind of understanding? But I was too terrified in the moment to try anything except survival. The bones in that chamber still haunt me too. Some of them were definitely human-sized, which raises questions I don't want to think about. Was I looking at the remains of previous cave explorers who hadn't been as lucky as I was? Or were they the bones of the creature's natural prey? I'll never know the answers to those questions, and honestly, I don't want to know. What I experienced in that cave in Arkansas was a glimpse into a world that exists parallel to ours, hidden in places where humans rarely venture. The fact that the creature let me live suggests these beings aren't automatically hostile to humans. Maybe they just want to be left alone, to live their lives in the deep places of the earth without interference from the surface world. But it also taught me that we're not alone on this planet, and we're definitely not the apex predators we think we are. Somewhere in the unmapped caves of the Ozark Mountains, something ancient and powerful is living in the darkness, probably with generations of knowledge about avoiding human contact. That day in the cave changed my whole perspective on exploration. I used to think I was discovering untouched wilderness, but now I realize I was probably trespassing on territories that have been occupied for far longer than human civilization has existed. The intelligence and restraint that creature showed me suggests these beings have been watching human activity for a long time, learning our patterns and behaviors, deciding when and how to interact with us. I was incredibly lucky that my encounter ended peacefully, but I have no doubt that other interactions haven't been as fortunate. Story 11. This happened in September of 2016, when I was on a solo canoe trip in the boundary waters of Minnesota, right near the Canadian border. I'd been planning this trip for months, 7 days of complete solitude, just me and my canoe, exploring some of the most remote wilderness you can find in the lower 48 states. I'd done the boundary waters dozens of times before, but this trip was special because I was going deeper into the wilderness than I'd ever gone. My plan was to paddle to Lake Basswood, then find one of the smaller islands where I could set up camp completely isolated from any other campers or day trippers. The weather had been perfect for the first few days. Clear skies, calm water, and just enough wind to keep the bugs manageable. I'd found this perfect little island on Basswood, maybe half an acre in size, with a good camping spot and easy access to deep water for fishing. It was my 4th night on the island when everything went wrong. I'd gone to sleep around 10:30 after sitting by my campfire and watching the stars. The night was clear and calm, with just the gentle lapping of waves against the rocky shoreline. It was exactly the kind of peaceful setting I'd come out there to experience. I woke up around midnight to the sound of something dragging my canoe across the gravel beach. At first, I thought maybe the wind had picked up and blown my canoe away from where I'd pulled it up on shore. But as I listened more carefully, I realized the sound was too rhythmic, too deliberate to be caused by wind and waves. I unzipped my tent flap and looked toward the water. In the moonlight, I could see this massive figure standing next to my canoe, examining it like it was trying to figure out what it was. The thing was huge, easily 8 feet tall, maybe taller, and covered in what looked like dark, matted hair. My first thought was that it was a bear, but the way it was standing and moving was all wrong. This thing was upright, using its hands to manipulate my canoe in ways that no bear could manage. It was turning the canoe over, running its hands along the hull, even picking up my paddle and examining it. I stayed frozen in my tent, watching through the partially opened flap. The creature was maybe 30 feet away from me, close enough that I could see it clearly in the bright moonlight. The body proportions were incredible. Shoulders that were probably 3 feet across, arms that hung down almost to its knees, and a head that looked too small for the massive body. Then it looked directly at me. Our eyes met across the campsite, and I felt this chill run down my spine. The face was almost human, but wrong in every way. Heavy brow ridge, flat nose, and these dark eyes that seemed to reflect the moonlight. There was intelligence there, awareness, like it knew exactly what I was and what I was doing on its island. For maybe a minute we just stared at each other. I was afraid to move, afraid to breathe, afraid that any sound might trigger this thing to attack. It stood perfectly still next to my canoe, holding my paddle in one massive hand like it was a toothpick. Then it did something that made my heart stop. It broke my paddle in half. Not by accident, not out of curiosity. It deliberately snapped the wooden paddle like it was demonstrating something. The crack echoed across the water, and then it dropped the pieces at its feet like it was making a statement. That's when I heard the other sounds. From across the water, from different directions around the lake, came these vocalizations that I can only describe as a mix of grunts and whistles. The creature on my island responded with similar sounds, and suddenly I realized I wasn't dealing with just one of these things. There were several of them, and they were communicating. The creature by my canoe made a series of grunting sounds toward the water, and the responses came from at least 3 different directions. I was surrounded, trapped on this little island with nowhere to run and no way to escape. I reached for my bear spray, which I kept right next to my sleeping bag. The movement must have caught the creature's attention because it turned and looked directly at my tent again. Then it started walking toward me. Each step covered maybe 4 feet, and it moved with this fluid grace that was terrifying. Something that big should be clumsy, should make noise, but this thing moved almost silently across the rocky ground. When it got to within about 10 feet of my tent, I decided I had to do something. I grabbed my emergency flare gun from my pack and fired it straight up into the air. The bright red flare burst overhead, lighting up the entire island like daylight. The creature jumped back, clearly startled by the sudden light and noise. It made this hissing sound that I felt in my chest, then looked up at the flare burning overhead. For a few seconds, it seemed confused or disoriented by the brightness. I used that moment to scramble out of my tent and grab more supplies. I had another flare, my bear spray, and my satellite communicator. But before I could use any of them, I heard heavy splashing from the water around the island. They were coming closer. Through the light of the flare, I could see dark shapes moving in the water on all sides of the island. At least 3 or 4 creatures, all of them swimming toward shore with powerful strokes that covered incredible distances. They moved through the water like it was their natural element, barely creating any splash despite their obvious size. The original creature had backed off to the edge of my campsite, but it wasn't leaving. It was watching me, making occasional grunting sounds toward the water, like it was coordinating with the others. I fired my second flare, hoping the light would keep them away. But instead of retreating, the creatures in the water seemed to get more active. The splashing got louder, and I could hear them communicating with each other in those weird grunt-whistle combinations. That's when one of them reached the shore. This thing emerged from the lake like something out of a nightmare. Water cascading off its massive frame. Dark hair plastered against its body, moving with this predatory confidence that made it clear I was completely outmatched. It was even bigger than the first one, probably close to 9 feet tall, and built like it could tear my tent apart with its bare hands. When it stood up to its full height on the beach, I could see the incredible muscle definition in its arms and shoulders. Now I had two of them on the island with me, and I could still hear at least two more in the water. I was completely surrounded with nowhere to go. I grabbed my bear spray and pointed it toward the nearest creature, but I was shaking so badly I could barely hold the can steady. The creatures seemed to notice my fear. They started making these low, rumbling sounds that felt like they were coming from inside my chest. Then something amazing happened. They started to back away. Not running or retreating in panic, but deliberately giving me space. The one that had just emerged from the water walked back toward the shoreline, while the original creature moved toward the other side of the island. It took me a few seconds to realize what was happening. The flares had worked, but not because the light scared them. They were giving me room to use the emergency signal, recognizing that I was calling for help. These things understood what the flares meant. They knew I was in distress and was trying to summon rescue, and for whatever reason, they decided to let me do it. I quickly activated my satellite communicator and sent an emergency signal with my GPS coordinates. The device confirmed that the message had been transmitted and help would be on the way. But rescue from that remote area would take hours, maybe until morning. The creatures seemed to understand this too. They didn't leave the island. Instead, they positioned themselves around the perimeter like they were settling in to wait. I could see their dark shapes moving around the edges of my campsite, always staying just outside the range of my headlamp. For the rest of the night, we maintained this bizarre standoff. The creatures would occasionally vocalize to each other, and sometimes I'd hear splashing as others moved around the lake. But they never approached my tent directly, and they didn't try to prevent me from tending my fire or moving around my campsite. It was like they were keeping me under observation without being actively threatening. Around dawn, I heard the sound of a motorboat approaching across the lake. The Park Service rescue team had received my emergency signal and was coming to investigate. As soon as the engine noise became audible, the creatures vanished. Not gradually, all at once, they just melted back into the forest and water like they had never been there. By the time the rescue boat reached my island, I was completely alone. The rangers found me sitting by my dead campfire, exhausted and shaken. When they asked what my emergency was, I told them I'd had a bear encounter and felt unsafe continuing the trip alone. It wasn't exactly a lie, but it wasn't the whole truth either. They loaded me and my gear into their boat and took me back to the ranger station. During the boat ride, I looked back at the island and could swear I saw movement in the tree line, like something was watching us leave. When we got to shore, I told the rangers I wanted to end my trip early and head home. They were understanding. Bear encounters can be traumatic, and they didn't question my decision to cut the trip short. But during the boat ride back, I noticed something that chilled me to the bone. My broken paddle pieces were gone. The creatures had taken them, cleaned up the evidence of their presence. The only sign that anything unusual had happened was the missing paddle, which could be explained a dozen different ways. I've been back to the Boundary Waters several times since then, but never alone, and never to that area of Lake Basswood. The experience changed my whole relationship with wilderness camping. I used to love the solitude of remote areas, but now I can't shake the feeling that I'm never really alone out there. What bothers me most about that night is the intelligence I witnessed, the way those creatures communicated with each other, coordinated their movements, and seemed to understand what my emergency signals meant. That wasn't instinctual animal behavior. That was reasoning and problem solving. And the fact that they chose not to harm me, even when I was completely at their mercy, suggests a level of restraint and possibly even compassion that's frankly remarkable. They could have easily killed me or prevented me from calling for help, but they didn't. The broken paddle was clearly a message, a demonstration of their strength and a warning about what could happen if they chose to be aggressive. But it was also measured, controlled. They destroyed my means of escape without harming me personally. I've done research since then on Sasquatch encounters in the Boundary Waters area, and there are reports going back decades of similar incidents. Large hair-covered creatures being spotted on remote lakes, strange vocalizations heard at night, campers having their equipment disturbed or moved. Most of the reports describe the same basic behavior pattern I experienced. Initial contact followed by observation and evaluation, but rarely actual aggression. It's like these creatures have developed protocols for dealing with human intrusions into their territory. The coordination between multiple creatures that night suggests they have complex social structures and communication systems. The way they position themselves around the island and maintain contact through vocalizations showed strategic thinking and group cooperation. But what haunts me most is the feeling that I was being tested somehow. The way they waited to see how I would react, gave me space when I showed distress, then allowed rescue to proceed. It felt like some kind of evaluation process. Maybe they were determining whether I was a threat to their territory or their families. Maybe they were just curious about this lone human who had wandered into their domain. Or maybe they were sending a message about boundaries and respect. I'll never know their true intentions, but I know one thing for certain. There are intelligent beings living in the remote wilderness of northern Minnesota who have been watching human activity for far longer than we've been aware of them. That night on Lake Basswood taught me that we share this planet with creatures that science hasn't classified yet, and they're perfectly capable of making decisions about when and how to interact with humans. I was incredibly fortunate that they chose to let me live to tell about it. But the missing paddle pieces remind me that they're always watching, always evaluating, and perfectly capable of making different choices next time. Story 12. This happened in April of 2010 when I was doing fieldwork on the Olympic Peninsula near Forks, Washington. I'm a botanist, and I'd been hired by the University of Washington to document rare moss species in the temperate rainforest out there. It was supposed to be a routine research trip, just me, my equipment, and 2 weeks of cataloging plant specimens in one of the most biodiverse ecosystems in North America. I'd been working in the area for about a week, spending my days hiking off trail through the incredibly dense forest, looking for specific moss varieties that only grow in very particular conditions. The Olympic Peninsula rainforest is unlike anywhere else. The canopy is so thick that even on sunny days, the forest floor stays in perpetual twilight. Everything is covered in moss and ferns, creating this almost otherworldly landscape. On this particular day, I was maybe 3 miles off the main trail, following what looked like a game path deeper into an area I'd never explored before. I'd found some promising specimens and was getting excited about potentially discovering a moss variety that hadn't been documented in this specific location. Around 2 in the afternoon, I heard these vocalizations coming from somewhere ahead of me on the path. At first, I thought it might be elk, or maybe black bears making territorial calls. The sounds were low-pitched, almost howling, but with this human-like quality that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. The calls would last maybe 10 seconds, then stop, then start again from what seemed like a slightly different location. I'd been working in forests my entire career, and I thought I knew all the sounds that wildlife makes. But these vocalizations were unlike anything I'd heard before, too structured to be random animal noise, but too wild to be human. I kept following the game path toward the sounds, partly out of scientific curiosity, and partly because that was the direction I needed to go to reach my next collection site. The forest was incredibly dense in this area, mostly Sitka spruce and western hemlock, with an understory so thick you couldn't see more than 20 feet in any direction. That's when I saw movement through the vegetation. There was something large moving through the forest parallel to my path, maybe 50 yards away. At first, I thought it was a black bear, but the way it was moving seemed wrong. The gait was too upright, too coordinated for a bear moving through that kind of dense undergrowth. I stopped and pulled out my binoculars to get a better look. Through the thick vegetation, I caught glimpses of what was definitely not a bear. This thing was walking upright, pushing through the dense forest like the vegetation wasn't even there, and it was big, way bigger than any person. The vocalizations started again, and I realized they were coming from the creature I was watching. It would stop, make these howling sounds, then continue moving through the forest, like it was calling to something or announcing its presence. I started following it, staying parallel to its path but keeping my distance. As a scientist, I was fascinated by what I was observing. This could be the discovery of a lifetime, documented evidence of an unknown primate species in the Pacific Northwest. But as I got closer, my scientific excitement started turning into fear. The creature was massive, easily 7.5 feet tall, maybe 8 feet. It was covered in reddish hair that looked thick and matted, like it had been living in this wet forest environment for years. The shoulders were incredibly broad, and the arms were disproportionately long, swinging as it walked. What really got my attention was how effortlessly it moved through terrain that was giving me serious trouble. I was constantly having to duck under fallen logs, push through thickets of devil's club and salmonberry bushes, navigate around marshy areas. But this thing just walked straight through everything like it wasn't there. Then it stopped and looked directly at me. Even at 50 yards through dense vegetation, I could feel its gaze. The face was a disturbing mixture of human and ape features, heavy brow ridge, flat nose, but with an intelligence in the eyes that was unmistakably aware. For maybe 30 seconds, we stared at each other through the forest undergrowth. I was completely frozen, afraid to move or make any sound that might provoke it. The creature tilted its head slightly, like it was studying me, trying to figure out what I was and what I was doing in its territory. Then it started walking toward me, not running or charging, just deliberately changing direction and pushing through the forest in my direction. Each step it took probably covered 4 feet, and it was moving through vegetation that would have taken me 10 minutes to navigate. I started backing away, but quietly, trying not to make sudden movements that might trigger a predatory response. The creature kept coming, methodically closing the distance between us. It was obvious that it could move much faster than me through this terrain if it wanted to. That's when it started making those vocalizations again, but now they were much closer and much louder. The sound seemed to come from deep in its chest, with this harmonic quality that I felt in my bones, and I realized it wasn't just making random noise. There was definitely a pattern, like it was trying to communicate something. When it got to within about 30 feet of me, I could smell it. The odor was overwhelming, like wet dog mixed with something organic and sour, maybe rotting vegetation or old meat. The smell was so strong it made my eyes water and my stomach turn. The creature stopped and started doing something that absolutely terrified me. It was breaking branches off the surrounding trees and throwing them in my direction. Not at me exactly, but near me, like it was demonstrating something or making a point about its strength. Some of these branches were 3 or 4 inches thick, and it was snapping them off like they were twigs. The sound of breaking wood echoed through the forest, and I could see the power in those massive arms. Then it picked up a fallen log that probably weighed 200 pounds and hurled it to one side like it was a piece of kindling. The message was crystal clear. This thing could tear me apart without breaking a sweat if it wanted to. But instead of attacking, it just stood there, watching my reaction to its display. There was something calculating about its behavior, like it was evaluating whether I understood the demonstration. I slowly started backing away again, keeping my hands visible and trying to project non-threatening body language. The creature watched me retreat, but didn't follow immediately. It seemed content to let me create some distance as long as I was moving away from its territory. After I'd backed up maybe 50 yards, it turned and started walking away through the forest. But before it disappeared completely, it stopped and looked back at me one more time. Then it let out another one of those howling vocalizations, longer and more complex than the others I'd heard. The call was answered immediately by similar vocalizations from at least two different directions in the forest. I wasn't dealing with just one creature. There were multiple individuals out there, and they were communicating with each other. I got out of that area as fast as I could move through the dense vegetation. It took me almost 2 hours to make it back to the main trail, and I was looking over my shoulder the entire time. Every sound in the forest, every breaking twig, every rustle of leaves had me convinced that thing was following me. When I finally reached my truck at the trailhead, I sat there for a long time, trying to process what I'd experienced. As a scientist, I knew I should document the encounter, maybe try to organize a return expedition with proper equipment and backup. But honestly, I was too shaken to think clearly about the scientific implications. All I wanted was to get away from that forest and back to civilization. I drove straight back to Port Angeles and checked into a motel for the night. I didn't sleep much. Every time I closed my eyes, I could see that creature's face staring at me through the forest undergrowth, could smell that overwhelming organic odor, could hear those haunting vocalizations. The next morning, I made the decision to cut my research trip short. I called the university and told them I'd completed my work in the area earlier than expected. It wasn't exactly true, but I couldn't bring myself to go back into that forest alone. I've been back to the Olympic Peninsula several times since then for other research projects, but never to that specific area. The experience changed my whole approach to fieldwork. I used to love the solitude of working alone in remote forests, but now I always make sure someone knows exactly where I'm going and when I'll be back. What bothers me most about that encounter is how intelligent the creature seemed. The way it had tracked my movement through the forest, positioned itself to intercept me, then made those deliberate demonstrations of strength. That wasn't random animal behavior. That was strategic thinking. And the vocalizations, they were definitely communication, not just noise. The patterns were too complex, too structured to be accidental. When it called out before leaving and got responses from multiple directions, I realized I'd stumbled into the territory of a social group, not a solitary animal. The fact that it chose not to harm me, despite obviously being capable of doing so, suggests these creatures have developed protocols for dealing with human intrusions. The branch breaking and log throwing felt like a warning, a demonstration of power meant to encourage me to leave without escalating to actual violence. I've done research since then on Sasquatch encounters in the Olympic Peninsula area, and the region has a long history of sightings. The dense forest, abundant water sources, and limited human access make it perfect habitat for a large, intelligent primate that wants to avoid contact with people. Many of the reports I've found describe similar behavior patterns: initial observation, followed by deliberate intimidation displays, but rarely actual attacks. It's like these creatures have learned how to manage human encounters in ways that protect their secrecy while minimizing conflict. The reddish hair color I observed matches descriptions from multiple other witnesses in the same general area. There seems to be a population of these creatures living in the deep forests of the Olympic Peninsula, probably with established territories and social structures. But what haunts me most is the intelligence I saw in those eyes. This wasn't some primitive relic species barely surviving in isolated pockets of wilderness. This was a highly evolved being that understood its environment completely and knew exactly how to deal with unexpected human contact. The way it had herded me away from its territory without actually harming me shows remarkable restraint and possibly even a form of compassion. It could have easily killed or seriously injured me, but chose instead to simply remove the threat through intimidation. I still do botanical research, but I'm much more aware now of the possibility that I'm not alone in remote forest environments. The Olympic Peninsula taught me that there are things living in the deep wilderness that science hasn't classified yet, and they're perfectly capable of remaining hidden from humans when they choose to. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd tried to communicate with that creature somehow. Would it have responded? Could we have established some kind of understanding? But I was too terrified in the moment to try anything except getting away safely. The multiple vocalizations I heard before leaving suggest these creatures have complex social networks and communication systems. They seem to be reporting on my presence and movements, maybe warning other group members about the human intrusion into their territory. What I experienced that day in the Olympic rainforest was a glimpse into a world that exists parallel to ours, hidden in the places where humans rarely venture. And I have no doubt that they're still out there, watching from the shadows, deciding when and how to interact with the occasional human who wanders too deep into their domain. The fact that I was allowed to leave unharmed suggests they don't see humans as automatic threats, but they're definitely prepared to defend their territory if necessary. I was incredibly fortunate that my encounter ended with intimidation rather than violence, but I have no illusions about how differently it could have gone. Story 13. This happened in October of 2018 when I was deer hunting in the Adirondack Mountains near Lake Placid, New York. I'd been planning this hunting trip for months. It was my first time hunting solo in the Adirondacks, and I was excited to try this remote area that a friend had told me about. He said the deer population was good and most hunters avoided the area because it was so far from any roads. I'd scouted the location a few weeks earlier and found the perfect spot for my tree stand, a big oak tree about 20 feet from a well-used game trail, surrounded by thick forest with good sight lines in multiple directions. The area was maybe 5 miles from the nearest parking area, accessible only by hiking through dense woods and crossing a couple of small streams. I got to my hunting spot around 3:30 in the morning on opening day. It was still completely dark, and I wanted to be settled in my tree stand well before sunrise. The weather was perfect for hunting, cool, calm, with just a light breeze that wouldn't carry my scent to any deer moving through the area. I climbed up to my stand and got comfortable, checking my rifle and settling in for what I hoped would be a productive morning. The forest was incredibly quiet, just the occasional sound of leaves rustling or a small animal moving through the underbrush. Around 4 in the morning, while it was still pitch black, I started hearing something moving around the base of my tree. At first, I thought it was probably a porcupine or maybe a raccoon just foraging around, but the sounds were too deliberate, too heavy to be small animals. Something big was down there, and it seemed to be investigating the area directly below my tree stand. I could hear footsteps in the fallen leaves, not the quick, light steps of deer, but slow, heavy footfalls that seemed almost human. The steps would move in one direction, stop for a while, then move in another direction. Like whatever was down there was systematically exploring the area around my tree. As the sky started to lighten up around 5:30, I could finally see what was making the noise. There was this massive figure moving around the base of my tree, following the exact path I'd taken when I hiked in. It was easily 8 feet tall, covered in black hair that had these silver-colored tips that caught the early morning light. Even in the dim dawn light, I could see this thing was built on a completely different scale than anything human. The shoulders were incredibly broad, probably 3 feet across, and the arms were so long they almost reached its knees. It was walking upright, but with this slight forward lean that made it look like it could drop to all fours and move just as easily. What really got my attention was how methodically it was tracking my scent trail. This thing was following the exact route I'd taken through the forest, stopping at places where I'd paused or touched trees for balance. It was hunting me, tracking me like I was the prey. I stayed absolutely still in my tree stand, afraid to make any movement that might draw its attention upward. My rifle was loaded and ready, but I was 20 feet up in a tree, and this thing was directly below me. If it decided to climb up, I'd be trapped with nowhere to go. The creature spent maybe 10 minutes following my trail around the base of the tree. Then it did something that made my blood run cold. It looked up and stared directly at me. Our eyes met through the tree branches, and I saw intelligence there that was definitely not animal. The face was a disturbing mixture of human and ape features, heavy brow ridge, flat nose, but with deep brown eyes that showed awareness and calculation. For maybe 30 seconds, we just stared at each other. I was trying not to move, trying not to even breathe, hoping it might lose interest and wander away. But it was obvious that it knew exactly where I was and what I was. Then it started shaking my tree. Not violently at first, just these rhythmic pushes that made the whole tree sway back and forth. My tree stand was attached to the trunk with straps and chains, but the movement was enough to make me grab onto the tree for balance. The creature would push the tree, let it settle, then push it again from a different angle. Each push was getting stronger, and I could feel the tree starting to really sway. My stand was secure, but if the tree moved too much, I could easily fall 20 feet to the ground. I tried shouting at it, hoping to scare it away. But instead of being startled by my voice, the creature responded with this roar that I felt in my chest. The sound was incredible, deeper and more powerful than any bear I'd ever heard, with this harmonic quality that seemed to echo through the entire forest. After it roared, the tree shaking got more violent. This thing was putting its full strength into trying to knock me out of the tree, and I could see the muscles in its arms and shoulders flexing with each push. The power was unbelievable. It was moving a tree that was probably 2 feet thick at the base, like it was a sapling. My tree stand was bouncing and swaying so violently that I had to wrap both arms around the tree trunk to keep from falling. My rifle was hanging by its sling, and I couldn't get a clear shot even if I wanted to take one. All I could do was hold on and hope the tree didn't break or my stand didn't come loose. The shaking continued for maybe 5 minutes, but it felt like hours. I was getting dizzy from all the movement, and my arms were cramping from holding onto the tree so tightly. I honestly thought this thing was going to shake me out of the tree and kill me when I hit the ground. Then, as suddenly as it had started, the shaking stopped. The creature stepped back from the tree and just looked up at me again. There was something different in its expression now, maybe satisfaction that it had made its point, or maybe just evaluation of whether I'd learned my lesson. It made this series of grunting sounds that sounded almost like communication. Not random animal noise, but structured vocalizations with definite patterns, like it was trying to tell me something or maybe calling to others in the area. Then it turned and walked away from my tree, moving through the forest with incredible speed and silence. Something that big should have been crashing through the underbrush, breaking branches and making noise. But within seconds, I couldn't hear it moving at all. I stayed in my tree stand for another hour, listening and watching for any sign that it might come back. My hands were shaking so badly I couldn't hold my rifle steady, and my heart was pounding so hard I was sure any deer in the area could hear it. Finally, around 7 in the morning, I worked up the courage to climb down from my tree. The whole time I was descending, I kept looking around, expecting to see that massive figure watching me from the forest. When I reached the ground, I found evidence of what had happened that I'll never forget. There were footprints all around the base of my tree. Massive prints that were easily twice as long as my hunting boots and much wider. The impressions were deep, showing just how heavy whatever made them must have been. You could see individual toe marks and what looked like claw indentations at the tips. But what really got to me were the handprints on the tree trunk. About 7 feet up from the base, there were clear impressions where the creature had gripped the tree to shake it. The prints were huge, probably 10 inches from wrist to fingertip, with thick finger marks and what looked like knuckle impressions in the bark. I took pictures with my phone, but when I tried to show them to people later, everyone had explanations. Bare claw marks, shadows playing tricks, digital artifacts. Nobody wanted to consider that they might be evidence of something unknown. I packed up my gear and hiked out of there as fast as I could move. The whole way back to my truck, I kept looking over my shoulder, convinced that thing was following me through the forest. Every sound, every breaking twig, every rustle of leaves had me convinced it was coming back. When I finally reached my vehicle, I threw my gear in the back and drove straight home. I didn't stop for coffee, didn't stop for gas, didn't stop for anything. All I wanted was to get away from those mountains and back to civilization. I never went back to that hunting spot. Hell, I never went back to that entire section of the Adirondacks. The experience had shaken me so badly that I couldn't focus on hunting anymore. Every time I climbed into a tree stand, I'd start thinking about that creature shaking the tree and wondering if it was down there somewhere, watching me. What bothers me most about that morning is how intelligent the creature seemed. The way it had tracked my scent trail, positioned itself at the base of my tree, then systematically tried to remove me from its territory. That wasn't random animal behavior, that was strategic thinking. And the fact that it stopped shaking the tree before actually knocking me down suggests it had control over its actions. This thing could have easily killed me, shaken me out of the tree, waited for me to fall, then finished me off. But it chose not to. The message was clear: get out of its territory and don't come back. The tree shaking itself was a perfect demonstration of power. It showed me exactly what it was capable of without actually harming me. Like a warning shot, next time might be different. I've done research since then on Sasquatch encounters in the Adirondack area, and the region has had sightings going back decades. Many of the reports describe similar behavior: tree shaking, territorial displays, encounters near hunting stands or campsites. What strikes me about these reports is how consistent they are regarding the creature's intelligence and restraint. Most encounters end with intimidation rather than violence, like these beings have developed protocols for dealing with human intrusions that minimize conflict while protecting their secrecy. The size and strength I witnessed that morning were incredible. Something that could shake a full-grown oak tree like it was a stick, that could move through dense forest without making any noise. That's a predator at the top of the food chain. But the intelligence was what really scared me. The calculation in those brown eyes, the systematic way it had tracked me, the measured response of tree shaking followed by withdrawal, that showed reasoning ability that's frankly terrifying. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd tried to communicate with it somehow. Would it have responded to peaceful gestures, or was the encounter always destined to be confrontational because I was in its territory with a weapon? The handprints on the tree trunk haunt me the most. The size and strength required to grip bark that hard, to shake a tree that violently. Those prints were evidence of something that shouldn't exist according to mainstream science. But I know what I experienced that October morning in the Adirondacks. I know there are things living in the remote forests of New York that are bigger, stronger, and smarter than we realize, and they don't want to be found. The fact that it let me leave alive suggests these creatures aren't automatically hostile to humans, but they're definitely prepared to defend their territory when necessary. I was incredibly fortunate that my encounter ended with intimidation rather than violence. I still hunt deer, but never alone anymore, and never in tree stands in remote areas. Because somewhere in the mountains of New York, something is watching from the shadows, tracking human movement, and making decisions about when intervention is necessary. That morning taught me that we're not the apex predators we think we are, especially when we venture into the deep wilderness alone. There are older, stronger things sharing those forests with us, and they've been watching our activities a lot longer than we've been aware of theirs. The memory of that tree swaying back and forth, of those intelligent brown eyes staring up at me, of the incredible power demonstrated in those handprints on the bark. Those images are burned into my mind forever. Because I encountered something that most people refuse to believe exists, and it chose to let me live to remember it. Story 14. This happened in July of 2009 when I was backpacking solo in Yellowstone National Park near Heart Lake, Wyoming. I'd been planning this trip for over a year, 7 days in the backcountry, completely off the grid, exploring some of the most remote areas of the park that most tourists never see. I had all the required permits for backcountry camping, and I'd done extensive research on the area. Heart Lake is about 8 miles from the nearest trailhead, accessible only by hiking through some pretty challenging terrain. But that's exactly what I wanted. Complete isolation from crowds and civilization. The first day and night went perfectly. I'd found this amazing campsite about a quarter mile from the lake, tucked into a grove of lodgepole pines with a small stream running nearby. The weather was ideal. Clear skies, cool nights, warm days. I spent the afternoon fishing and caught enough cutthroat trout for dinner. It was my second night when things started going wrong. I'd gone to bed around 10:30, exhausted from a full day of hiking and fishing. I was sleeping in my tent about 15 feet from where I'd hung my food bag, following all the bear safety protocols that are mandatory in Yellowstone backcountry. I'd strung the food bag between 2 trees, about 12 feet off the ground and 6 feet out from each trunk, high enough and far enough that no bear should be able to reach it, or so I thought. Around midnight, I woke up to the sound of something messing with my food bag. At first, I figured it was probably a black bear that had picked up the scent of my dinner from earlier. Bear encounters are pretty common in Yellowstone backcountry, and I'd dealt with them before. The standard procedure is to make noise, look big, and back away slowly while giving the bear plenty of space. But when I unzipped my tent flap to look outside, what I saw made my blood run cold. There was this massive figure standing under my food bag, easily reaching up to grab it without having to climb or jump. The thing was huge, at least 9 feet tall, maybe even bigger, and it was definitely not a bear. It was standing completely upright, using its hands to manipulate the rope that held my food bag. Even in the dim moonlight, I could see it was covered in reddish-brown hair and had proportions that were way too human-like to be any known animal. The most disturbing part was how casually it was accessing my food. The bag was 12 feet up and positioned specifically to be unreachable by bears. But this creature was just standing there, flat-footed, and pulling it down like it was hanging at eye level. I grabbed my headlamp and switched it on, pointing the beam toward the creature. When the light hit it, it turned to look directly at me, and I got my first clear view of what I was dealing with. The face was a nightmare mixture of human and ape features. Heavy brow ridge, flat nose, but with amber-colored eyes that reflected my headlamp beam like an animal's. The jaw was massive, and when it opened its mouth slightly, I could see huge teeth that were yellowed and worn. But what really got my attention was the intelligence in those eyes. This wasn't some mindless animal acting on instinct. It was studying me, evaluating the situation, making decisions about what to do next. For maybe 30 seconds, we just stared at each other. The creature was holding my food bag in one hand like it weighed nothing, while using its other hand to casually tear open the waterproof stuff sack where I'd stored my supplies. The smell hit me then. This overwhelming combination of sulfur and rotting vegetation mixed with something organic that made my stomach turn. The odor was so strong it seemed to coat the inside of my nose and throat, making it hard to breathe properly. The creature pulled out a package of freeze-dried meals and examined it with obvious curiosity. It turned the package over in its massive hands, sniffed it, then tossed it aside and reached for something else. That's when I realized this thing wasn't just hungry. It was investigating my gear, studying human technology and food packaging. The behavior was too deliberate, too methodical to be random foraging. I tried to make noise to scare it away, banging my metal camp cup against my water bottle. The sound echoed through the forest, but instead of being startled, the creature just looked at me with what seemed like mild annoyance. Then it did something that absolutely terrified me. It picked up a rock about the size of a basketball and crushed it between its hands like it was made of clay. The sound of the granite cracking and crumbling was incredibly loud in the quiet forest. Rock fragments scattered across the ground, and I could see the incredible muscle definition in the creature's arms and shoulders as it demonstrated its strength. The message was crystal clear. This thing could do the same to my skull without breaking a sweat. After dropping the rock fragments, it went back to examining my food supplies, but now it was watching me at the same time, like it wanted me to understand the demonstration while it continued its investigation. I stayed frozen in my tent, afraid to make any movement that might provoke it. This creature had just shown me it could kill me easily, and I was completely alone in the middle of nowhere with no way to call for help. The creature spent maybe 10 more minutes going through my food bag, examining different items and occasionally glancing in my direction. It seemed particularly interested in my water purification tablets, turning the small bottle over and over in its massive hands. Then it did something even more disturbing. It started examining my campsite with obvious intelligence. It walked over to my camp stove and crouched down to look at it closely, touching different parts like it was trying to understand how it worked. Then it moved to my water filter, picking it up and manipulating the pump mechanism. This wasn't random curiosity. This was systematic investigation of human technology by something with obvious intelligence and problem-solving abilities. The creature spent several minutes examining my gear, always staying aware of my position in the tent. It would look at an item, manipulate it, then glance at me like it was gauging my reaction to its behavior. Finally, it stood up to its full height and looked directly at me again. In my headlamp beam, those amber eyes seemed almost hypnotic. There was recognition there, understanding that I was watching its every move and drawing conclusions about what it was capable of. Then it let out this low rumble that I felt in my chest cavity. Not a roar or growl, but this deep, harmonic vocalization that seemed to vibrate through the ground. The sound was unlike anything I'd ever heard, too structured to be random noise, but too wild to be human communication. The rumble was answered immediately by similar sounds from different directions in the forest. At least 2 other vocalizations, maybe 3, coming from various points around my campsite. I wasn't dealing with just one creature. There were multiple individuals out there, and they were communicating with each other. That's when I realized I was completely surrounded. The original creature made another series of vocalizations, and the responses came from what seemed like different positions than before. These things were moving around my campsite, coordinating their activities through some kind of vocal communication system. I tried to stay calm, but panic was setting in. I was alone in the Yellowstone backcountry, surrounded by unknown creatures that were obviously intelligent and incredibly powerful. The nearest help was at least 8 miles away, and I had no way to signal for assistance. The original creature seemed to notice my increasing fear. It tilted its head slightly, like it was studying my emotional state, then made this softer vocalization that almost sounded reassuring. Then, without any warning, it simply walked away from my campsite and disappeared into the forest. The transition was so sudden, it left me completely disoriented. One second I was staring at this massive creature examining my gear. The next second, I was alone in the forest with just my headlamp beam illuminating empty space. But I could still hear movement in the trees around my campsite. The other creatures were still out there, still moving around, still occasionally vocalizing to each other. I was being watched and evaluated from multiple directions. I stayed awake the rest of the night, listening to occasional sounds in the forest and jumping at every breaking twig or rustling leaf. The vocalizations continued sporadically until just before dawn, when everything finally went quiet. When the sun came up, I immediately started packing my gear. I'd planned to spend 5 more days in the backcountry, but there was no way I was staying in that area after what I'd experienced. As I was breaking down my campsite, I found evidence of what had happened that still gives me chills. My food bag had been completely emptied, but not destroyed. Every item had been removed and examined, then placed in a neat pile about 20 feet from where the bag had been hanging. Like someone had conducted a systematic inventory of my supplies. But what really disturbed me was how the items had been organized. Similar things were grouped together, all the freeze-dried meals in one pile, all the energy bars in another, all the cooking supplies in a third pile. This wasn't random scattering by a hungry animal. This was deliberate organization by something with obvious intelligence. I also found footprints around my campsite that were easily 20 inches long and at least 8 inches wide at the ball of the foot. The impressions were deep, showing just how heavy whatever made them must have been. But the most unsettling discovery was a series of handprints on trees around my campsite. About 7 and 8 feet up from the ground, there were clear impressions where massive hands had gripped the bark. The prints were huge, probably 12 inches from wrist to fingertip, with thick finger marks that had actually dented the tree bark. I took pictures of the prints and the organized gear with my phone. But when I tried to show them to the rangers at the backcountry office, they had explanations for everything. Bear activity, wind scatter, pareidolia, making you see patterns that aren't there. Nobody wanted to consider that they might be evidence of something unknown living in Yellowstone's remote areas. I hiked out that morning and drove straight home to Colorado. The experience had shaken me so badly that I couldn't focus on outdoor activities for months afterward. Every time I went camping, I'd start thinking about those amber eyes watching me and wondering what else might be out there in the darkness. What bothers me most about that night is the obvious intelligence I witnessed. The systematic way that creature had examined my gear, the coordination with other individuals through vocalizations, the deliberate organization of my food supplies. That wasn't animal behavior. That was reasoning, planning, problem solving. And the fact that they chose not to harm me, despite obviously being capable of doing so, suggests these creatures have developed protocols for dealing with human contact. The rock-crushing demonstration was clearly meant to establish dominance without actually causing injury. I've done extensive research since then on Sasquatch encounters in Yellowstone, and the park has had sightings going back decades. Many of the reports describe similar behavior patterns: systematic investigation of human gear, coordination between multiple individuals, demonstrations of strength followed by withdrawal. The thermal features around Heart Lake would provide perfect habitat for large primates. Natural hot springs for warmth, abundant water sources, and limited human access due to the remote location. If a population of unknown primates was living in Yellowstone, that area would be ideal territory. But what haunts me most is the feeling that I was being tested that night. The way that creature had watched my reactions while it demonstrated its capabilities, the organized examination of my supplies, the coordination with others in the forest, it felt like some kind of evaluation process. Maybe they were determining whether I posed a threat to their territory or their families. Maybe they were just curious about human technology and wanted to investigate without being observed. Or maybe they were sending a message about boundaries and respect for their habitat. I'll never know their true intentions, but I know one thing for certain. There are intelligent beings living in the remote wilderness of Yellowstone that are far more sophisticated than mainstream science acknowledges. The fact that my food was organized rather than scattered, that my gear was examined rather than destroyed, that I was allowed to leave unharmed, despite being completely at their mercy, all of that suggests these creatures have complex decision-making processes and possibly even ethical frameworks for dealing with humans. That night near Heart Lake taught me that we share our national parks with beings that most people refuse to believe exist. And they're perfectly capable of remaining hidden from human observation when they choose to, while occasionally making contact on their own terms. The organized piles of my supplies still haunt me. Someone, or something, had spent considerable time and energy examining every item I'd brought into the backcountry, then arranged everything in logical groups before melting back into the forest without a trace. That level of intelligence, combined with their obvious physical capabilities, makes me wonder what else they might be capable of, and whether my peaceful encounter was typical or whether I was incredibly fortunate that night in the Wyoming wilderness. Story 15. This happened in June of 2017 when I was hiking solo in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park near Clingman's Dome in Tennessee. I'd driven down from Ohio for a long weekend, planning to spend 3 days exploring some of the more remote trails in the park. The Smokies have always been one of my favorite places to hike. The biodiversity is incredible, and you can find sections of trail where you might not see another person all day. I'd started early that morning from the Clingman's Dome parking area, taking the Appalachian Trail south for about 2 miles before branching off onto this lesser-known side trail that led to a waterfall I'd read about online. The weather had been perfect when I started. Clear skies, comfortable temperature, just a light breeze moving through the trees. But around noon, as I was getting close to the waterfall, the temperature suddenly dropped by what felt like 20 degrees. Within minutes, this thick fog started rolling in from nowhere, so dense I could barely see 10 feet in front of me. I'd been hiking in mountains my whole life, and I'd never experienced such a dramatic weather change so quickly. 1 minute I was walking in bright sunlight, the next minute I was surrounded by fog so thick it felt like walking through a cloud. The forest around me had gone completely silent too. No birds singing, no insects buzzing, no small animals rustling in the underbrush. Just this oppressive quiet that made every step I took sound incredibly loud. I decided to keep going toward the waterfall, figuring the fog would burn off once the afternoon sun got higher. I was using my phone's GPS to stay on track, moving slowly and carefully through the thick mist. That's when I saw the silhouette. Through the fog, maybe 20 feet ahead of me, I could make out this massive dark shape moving between the trees. At first, I thought it might be a black bear, but the way it was moving was all wrong. This thing was upright, walking on 2 legs with a gait that looked almost human but somehow off. I stopped and watched as the shape moved parallel to the trail I was following. Even through the thick fog, I could tell this thing was huge, easily 7.5 feet tall, maybe 8 feet, and broad. The shoulders looked like they were 3 feet across. As I watched, the fog seemed to thin out just a bit, giving me a clearer view of what I was dealing with. The creature was covered in dark grey hair that looked matted and wet from the fog. The arms were incredibly long, hanging down almost to its knees as it walked. But what really got my attention was the head. It had this conical shape that was definitely not human, but way too large and wrong to be any animal I knew. Then it stopped and looked directly at me. Even at 20 feet through the fog, I could see its eyes. They were this dull red color, probably just reflecting what little light was filtering through the mist, but they seemed to glow with their own internal light. We stared at each other for maybe 30 seconds. I was afraid to move, afraid to breathe, afraid that any sound might trigger this thing to attack. The creature tilted its head slightly, like it was studying me, trying to figure out what I was and what I was doing in its territory. Then it started doing something that made my blood run cold. It was copying my movements. I raised my hand to shield my eyes from the fog, and it raised its massive arm in the same gesture. I took a step to the right, and it took a step to the right. When I shifted my weight to my left foot, it did the same thing. This wasn't random behavior. It was deliberately mimicking my actions like some kind of twisted game. And the intelligence behind it was obvious. This thing was studying my body language, learning my movements, maybe trying to understand how humans function. I tried taking a step backward, and it immediately took a step forward. When I moved right, it moved left, like it was trying to cut off my escape routes. This creature wasn't just copying me, it was herding me, controlling my movement through the forest. The fog was getting thicker, and the mimicking game continued for several minutes. Every gesture I made, every shift in position, it would copy or counter with its own movement. Like we were engaged in this bizarre dance where it was learning to anticipate my actions. That's when the smell hit me. This nauseating combination of decay and wet moss that made my stomach turn. The odor was so strong, it felt like it was coating the inside of my throat, making it hard to breathe properly. The creature seemed to notice my reaction to the smell and made this low rumbling sound that I felt in my chest. Not quite a growl, but this deep vocalization that had an almost musical quality to it. The sound echoed through the fog-shrouded forest in a way that made it seem like it was coming from multiple directions. Then I heard other sounds answering from different parts of the forest. Similar vocalizations were coming from at least 3 different directions, maybe more. The fog was so thick I couldn't see beyond 20 feet in any direction. But it was obvious that I was surrounded by multiple creatures. The original creature continued its mimicking behavior, but now it was incorporating vocalizations too. When I cleared my throat nervously, it made this grunting sound that seemed like it was trying to copy human speech patterns. The intelligence behind this behavior was terrifying. This wasn't some mindless animal acting on instinct. It was engaged in what seemed like sophisticated behavioral analysis, learning human movement patterns and vocal responses. I tried backing away slowly, but every step I took was matched by a step forward from the creature. It was maintaining the same distance between us, while other vocalizations continued to echo through the fog from different directions. Then it did something that absolutely terrified me. It started beating its chest in the same rhythm as my heartbeat. I could feel my heart pounding from fear and adrenaline, and this thing was somehow matching that rhythm with its chest beating. Thump, 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 thump. The exact cadence of my racing pulse, how it could detect my heartbeat from 20 feet away, I have no idea. But the mimicking was so precise, so synchronized with my own physiological responses, that it felt like this creature could somehow sense what was happening inside my body. The chest beating got louder and more aggressive, and the answering calls from the forest got closer. Whatever was happening, the other creatures were responding to some kind of signal, moving in toward my position. I made the decision to run. I turned and started sprinting back down the trail toward the main Appalachian Trail, crashing through the fog without caring about noise or direction. Behind me, I could hear heavy movement through the forest, not just from one direction, but from multiple points around where I'd been standing. The fog seemed to be following me as I ran, staying thick and impenetrable no matter how far I got from the original encounter site. I was running blind, using my hands to feel for trees and rocks to avoid running into obstacles. I could hear them following me. Heavy footsteps in the underbrush, branches breaking, and those eerie vocalizations echoing through the mist. But the sounds seemed to be staying behind me, not getting closer, like they were herding me in a specific direction rather than trying to catch me. After what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 minutes, I finally broke out of the fog bank and found myself back on the main Appalachian Trail in bright sunlight. The transition was so sudden, it was disorienting. 1 second, I was running through thick fog. The next second, I was standing in clear mountain air with perfect visibility. I turned to look back toward where I'd come from, and there was this wall of fog sitting in the valley, like it was being held there by some invisible barrier. I didn't stop running until I reached my car at the Klingman's Dome parking area. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get my keys in the ignition, and it took me 3 tries to start the engine. The drive back to Ohio was a blur. I kept thinking about that creature mimicking my movements, copying my heartbeat, demonstrating intelligence that was far beyond anything I thought was possible for an unknown animal. When I got home, I immediately started researching Sasquatch encounters in the Great Smoky Mountains. What I found didn't make me feel any better. The park has had sightings going back decades, with many reports describing creatures that matched exactly what I'd experienced. But what really disturbed me were the accounts that mentioned the mimicking behavior. Apparently, multiple witnesses have reported Sasquatch creatures copying human movements and vocalizations, like they're studying our behavior patterns for reasons we can't understand. The fog itself bothered me too. Several reports mentioned encounters that occurred during sudden, unexplained fog banks that seemed to appear and disappear without any meteorological explanation. Like these creatures had some way of controlling local weather conditions, or at least taking advantage of them. I've been back to the Smokies several times since then, but never alone, and never to that specific area near Klingman's Dome. The experience changed my whole relationship with solo hiking in remote areas. What haunts me most about that day is the intelligence I witnessed. The systematic way that creature had studied my movements, learned my patterns, even somehow detected my heartbeat. That suggests cognitive abilities that are frankly terrifying. And the coordination with multiple individuals through vocalizations shows these creatures have complex social structures and communication systems. They weren't just randomly encountering me. They were working together to study and control the situation. The mimicking behavior still gives me chills when I think about it. Why would a creature copy human movements so precisely? Was it trying to understand how we function? Was it some kind of intimidation tactic? Or was it something more complex that I can't even guess at? The fact that they let me escape suggests they weren't trying to harm me, but they were definitely controlling the encounter. The way they herded me back toward the main trail, the way the fog seemed to lift right as I reached safety, it felt orchestrated, like I was being managed rather than hunted. I've done extensive research on primate behavior since then, and mimicry is actually a sign of advanced intelligence in many species. These creatures were demonstrating sophisticated learning abilities and social awareness that far exceeds what we see in any known primates. But the heartbeat mimicking still puzzles me the most. How could something detect human pulse patterns from 20 feet away? And why would it copy that rhythm so precisely? The implications of that kind of sensory ability are disturbing when you think about what else they might be able to detect about human physiology. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd tried to communicate with that creature instead of running. Would it have responded to peaceful gestures? Could we have established some kind of understanding? But I was too terrified in the moment to think about anything except getting away. The fog wall that seemed to contain the encounter still bothers me. I've never experienced weather that localized and controllable. It was like stepping between two different worlds. The foggy realm where these creatures existed and the normal world where humans felt safe. That day in the Great Smoky Mountains taught me that there are things living in our national parks that are far more intelligent and sophisticated than mainstream science acknowledges. And they're perfectly capable of studying us just as intensively as we study them. The mimicking behavior suggests they've been observing human activity for a long time, learning our patterns and behaviors, maybe preparing for more complex interactions in the future. What I experienced might have been some kind of field research on their part, collecting data about how humans respond to contact. But the memory that haunts me most is the precision of that heartbeat mimicking. Something that could detect and copy my physiological responses so accurately has capabilities that go far beyond anything we understand about non-human intelligence. And somewhere in the fog-shrouded valleys of the Great Smoky Mountains, they're still out there, still watching, still learning. Still deciding when and how to make contact with the humans who wander into their ancient territory. That chest-beating rhythm still echoes in my mind sometimes, perfectly synchronized with the terror I felt that day. Because I encountered something that shouldn't exist according to everything we think we know about the natural world. And it knew me better than I knew myself.